Comment time is not intended as a time to raise issues unique to a particular student, staff member, or administrator. Rather, it's time to provide your insights on issues more generally and of a wider concern. As a general rule, the board will not respond to public comment. I ask that you begin your comments by clearly stating your name and school attendance area. Please limit your comments to 2 minutes. We will use a timer. The board neither endorses nor censors any opinions expressed during public comment. I ask that you keep all comments civil and respectful and avoid personal attacks on others. The audience should refrain from making comments or engaging in applause, but feel free to wave your hands in support of a speaker. So in the room, I have 3 names. So first we have Wendy Giora.
Hello? All right. Bingo. Good evening. I'm Dr. Wendy Giora. I live in the Issaquah High School attendance area. At the last board meeting on January 26th, 2 parents reported that funds from the 2012 bond earmarked to complete various projects at Issaquah High School Stadium were marked as completed by this board, even though many of the projects promised were not done. On January 15th, a few days prior to the board meeting, an article in the Seattle Times announced the board had spent school bond money on the wrong projects. The result is that the tax-paying voters in the Issaquah School District want answers. Bond money is specifically earmarked for funding projects that were promised. The Issaquah School Board failed in their fiduciary responsibility to ensure that this happened. Another result of this gross, irresponsible mismanagement is that our district now has a negative rating from Moody's indicating the Issaquah School Board's ability to repay its debt may be deteriorating. We understand that you are putting in safeguards and better tracking to make sure this doesn't happen again, but that is not enough. The taxpayers must be provided with information that will reveal who is responsible for this and exactly what happened and who authorized it. We require definitive answers and no excuses. Thank you.
Thank you for your input. Okay, next, we have Julia Weed.
Hi, I'm Julia Weed, and I am a teacher at Issaquah Middle School. In the past 2 years, the cuts that you have made have almost been entirely in-building cuts, and we are seeing the negative effects across the district, particularly as it relates to the safety and quality of our schools. Money has been spent at district admin buildings, on web design, and on building schools rather than supporting the existing schools themselves. The people who have been cut at the district are people who directly support students and staff. We could get rid of our fancy branding and this fancy building, but we don't. We could call a special vote to divert bond funding, but we don't. And then the district has the audacity to say that they expect teachers to provide tier 2 academic interventions in our classrooms while simultaneously teaching content to the grade level students with no other teacher in the room in larger sized, more heavily impacted classrooms than we've ever seen before. I teach an academic intervention class, and I have taught several different academic intervention classes over the years. Those classes are capped for a reason. It is almost impossible at the middle school level to run small groups in that class because I have students who need wildly different things, all while exhibiting some of the negative behaviors that lack of academic success and mental health support can lead to. To expect me and my colleagues to be able to provide the services and supports that students desperately need in my gen ed classrooms, which are numbering in the high 30s, is ludicrous. And it is a disservice to me, and it is a disservice especially to my students who deserve time, attention, support, and funding. And this is coming from a school who has an MTSS specialist. It is much worse at schools with no PBSES coaches because you cut those. Running a school district like a corporation rather than like a public service that serves the people who need it the most is a disrespectful disservice. You claim to be in favor of intervention, yet you have no budget for PBSES or MTSS. You're not listening to the people on the ground. We have given you valuable input. Please listen to teachers and to staff and to our students. Thank you.
Thank you for your input. Next, we have Barbara Hawley. Thank you. On behalf of the board, I'd like to thank each of you for, oh, Stephen, is there anyone on the Zoom? There is not. Okay, thank you. On behalf of the board, I'd like to thank each of you for attending our meeting and sharing your point of view. The board appreciates the comments made at our meetings and through email. We're not able to respond to your comments in the moment of the meeting, but rest assured we've heard your voices and we'll take your comments into consideration. Thank you.
Oh. Yeah, you do now have input on this.
Okay, start there. Mackenzie, can you unmute? Mackenzie, can you unmute, please? There we go.
Hi, can I request that Zoe Yakamini goes first?
Sure. Is Zoe the other person on screen?
Yes, Zoe
Thank
is the
you.
other person on screen.
That's super helpful. Zoe, over to you. If you could tell us your name and your school.
Hi. Wait, hello, my name is Zoe Yakamini from the Thespian board at Issaquah High School. I'm here today to shine some light on the many enthusiastic and dedicated students here in our theater program. When you cut the theater manager position in 2021, we as students lost a stable and consistent theater teacher, director, and mentor. Because of that, we've been scrambling to maintain some resemblance of a theater program these last couple of years. But that last month, a small group of us were able to attend the state thespian competition for the first time since 2019. All 5 of us scored top in our categories, all achieving scores of excellence. We are capable, and I just can't wait to see what we can fully achieve when we have our theater teacher, Ms. Wolfenden-Louis, back able to guide, teach, and shepherd our group. In other news, we had 38 kids sign up to be a part of our tech crew for our musical. 38. That's 38 kids who are wanting and excited to stay after school for literal hours on end for weeks to be granted an opportunity to learn about technical theater from our amazing director, Ms. Wolfenden-Louis. If we had a tech class like before you cut the theater manager position, those kids wouldn't have to stay after school. They could have a class where they could go and learn so much more with the curriculum not just confined to 1 week. In the end, we have 36 tech members, 21 cast members, and 7 band members. That's 64 IHS students just a part of our musical. We deserve more support. I'm not sure if you noticed, but I'm coming to you today from our gorgeous theater at Issaquah High School, joined by the very talented, enthusiastic cast of our musical, the 25th Annual Putnam County Spelling Bee. Everybody say hi. Hi. We stopped rehearsal so we can say hi to you, but more importantly, invite you to our show, the Issaquah Spelling Bee. Spelling Bee is a comedic musical about young kids in a spelling bee and their very adult-like problems. It is a blast and in general, just a really great show. Shows are a month away from now, shows being March 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th at 7 p.m. with a matinee on the 18th. Please. With these budget cuts, you are altering our lives, our futures, our careers. We've been working incredibly hard. Please do come see it. Come see the talented and passionate kids, what we're able to accomplish, and who you will be impacting with budget cuts. We want you there. March 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th at 7 p.m. Thank you. Oh, hi, Miss Weed.
Thank you, Zoe. And thank you for the invitation. Let's see.
You're welcome. Please come.
Okay, Mackenzie, are we ready for you now? Awesome. Over to you.
Hi, my name is Mackenzie Wilmot Wade. I am a junior at Issaquah High School and the vice president of the IHS Thespian Society. I'm once again here to advocate for better support for our theater department at IHS. I wanted to start by acknowledging the fact that y'all have a very hard decision to make. I'm aware of that. The thespian board is aware of that. All of the students that you see from our drama department are aware of that. However, that does not excuse the fact that budget cuts routinely hit the arts programs harder than others. My friend and I were talking about this the other day, and she told me about a conversation that she had with her cousin who's in sports. He said, gosh, it's really screwed up that you have to fight so hard just so you can have a class. I've never had to worry about our funding. And that took me by surprise because it is screwed up, because I've come from a theater family and I've always been told that funding gets cut from the arts first and that I will always have to fight for it. So I guess my point here is why. I'm a junior in high school. I'm 16 years old, and yet I have spent hours upon hours trying to find a way to keep our theater department together. And to be honest, I'm tired. I intend to go into theater professionally, so I know that I'm going to have to spend the rest of my life fighting for it. So why does that have to start now? Why are you forcing us to defend what we love in high school? Why should I have to worry that I'll come back next year without a tech theater class for the 3rd year in a row? Our teachers are doing the best they can, but they need support. Miss Wolfenden Louie is working as a history teacher at Skyline and coming to IHS after school to direct. Miss West and Miss Henderson are English teachers who help direct and take on theater classes when they can. Again, they are doing the best they can, but this isn't sustainable. If you keep cutting the theater manager and technical theater positions, we won't be able to continue our department. So please consider the impact your decisions actually have on the students and on the program. For many of my peers, theater is the only reason they like school. So please stop forcing us to fight for what we love.
Thank you. Okay, that was great. On behalf of the board, I'd like to thank each of you for attending our meeting and sharing your point of view. We appreciate your comments and live in the meeting or also through email. So we will move on in our agenda to the approval of the consent agenda. Do I have a motion?
I move the consent agenda be approved as presented.
Second.
The consent agenda is a meeting management tool whereby the board is able to pass multiple items in one motion. The consent agenda items have been reviewed by the board prior to the meeting. So with that, I will ask for a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any not in favor? Any against? Okay, thank you. Consent agenda passes. Next, we have the establishment of the regular agenda. Superintendent, are there any changes to the regular agenda?
There are no changes.
Thank you. So how about I pass over to you for works in progress?
Great. Thank you, President Mullins. Before we get started, we had thought about doing this at our last meeting, but wanted to just have a continued celebration of a very important person to my right, which is Diane Gambari, the executive assistant to the superintendent and support and liaison to the board. So last meeting, the board approved Diane's resignation. Diane has been a wonderful support to me as I have transitioned to the district as a superintendent and provides excellent support to the board and teams across the district and provides responses and follow up to the community. So she is retiring, and the next chapter for Diane will be an important next step in her journey as a person, but also with her family. So I just want to take a moment to pause to recognize Diane and see if the board would like to say anything as well.
Yes. So I'd like to take this time again to celebrate you. This phenomenal milestone for a phenomenal person. Congratulations on your decision to retire. I am incredibly excited for you as you prepare for your next phase. I know that I'm working through all my emotions about what that means on this topic, but just want to make sure. So we wish you the absolute best. Any other comments?
Well, I feel honored to have been part of the interview committee that brought you on. So I feel like we've kind of gone on this journey together, and just want to thank you for all of the herding of cats that you do. I know it's not insignificant, and I think a lot of people don't realize that a big part of the of your job is to keep track of the board and make sure we know what on earth we're supposed to be doing when we're supposed to be doing it. So thank you very much for all of that.
And I'd like to say thank you too, for that always very cheerful voice that's on the other end of the phone when I call and interrupt your day when you already have 5 other things going and you take the time to deal with whatever my question is or whatever I am looking to have addressed. So I appreciate you always being on the ball and ready to support me and our other board members. Thank you. And I wish you well in this retirement.
And I would say I remember Jan Woltseth, who sat on the board previously, always talked about the care and nurturing of the board. And I think you've always been really good about that. Especially you've put the most treat in our board retreats as possible. So I do appreciate that. But I think one thing that I, as a board member, am really going to miss is just your leadership amongst the other administrative staff. When you're not here, it's noticeable, but you're also good about making sure that those that are around you, the other staff members, are well supported, so that whether it's Nancy or Bethany or who comes and sits in that seat, that you've been a mentor to them, that you are a leader to them. And so all of that is going to be very missed and very difficult to replace. But in the meantime, enjoy where you're off to, and just know that you're going to free up a lot more Thursday nights.
You know, from the moment I first met you, you helped introduce me to this role and helped that orientation and transition. You've been so kind and so patient. And you are so incredibly good at your job and detail oriented to be able to allow us to, you know, you can turn whatever policy language you want and help us to really form that. Like the work you do to put into our annual Board of Distinction applications that we know, even though it's a board thing, that falls squarely in your lap. And you just do everything with such grace. It's been really incredible to be on this journey with you at our side. So thank you.
Thank you all. I wasn't expecting to hear this tonight. So you've caught me a little bit off guard, but I appreciate each and every one of you. It's truly been a pleasure to work with you, and I look forward to working with you some more for the next few weeks here. Thank you. Thank you.
Surprise unlocked. Good job.
A few months.
Right.
A few months. Just Diane's target date for is going to be the end of August, beginning of August. So
The beginning of
August. So we will be working. So I'm like, there's a bit of a new, yeah. Nice try. Yes. Director Meraldo will be working to serve on a selection committee with me and a handful of others. We will move that process forward, but the celebrations will continue in honor of your contribution. So this is just the start, and get guests prepared for more surprises, because you know that's kind of part of the fun. So all right, thank you. Okay, I'm going to continue on with some pretty fun news. There are a range of quirky, I think, and unique, but also just great reflection of our work across the district. So first and foremost, we did have a recent kindergarten class aid in a proposal at Cougar Ridge Elementary School, where the person enlisted the support of students and staff to be able to propose for a marriage. And that was just one of the fun, I'll just pass these pictures around about this, but just part of the fun things that we do in our schools to support our staff, which is to help them be humans and to invite their family and loved ones into their universe. So I thought that was a nice thing that Principal Drew Terry spoke to me about and shared some fun pictures. And it was the classroom of a teacher that I actually got to visit in kindergarten, and then my very first days visiting schools. And so I might actually just ask, hey, how's that kindergarten teacher doing? And Principal Terry said, actually, this was something unique and fun that happened recently. So just sharing some fun, quirky news about how we are supporting our staff to, be full people. I'd also like to share that Andrea Mealy, the ASB advisory teacher at Cougar Mountain Middle School, has been named the Middle Level Advisor of the Year. This is a big honor and award. And the award is sponsored by the Association of Washington Student Leaders, which is part of the AWSP. And Principal Erin McKee stated in her support of Andrea that Andrea is an extraordinary educator and leader who has a deep commitment to strengthening school communities and ensuring the growth and development of students and student leaders. She believes in community building, inclusion, and service to others to provide the strongest path forward toward student engagement and empowerment at school and in the wider world. And so Andrea will be formally honored as the middle level advisor of the year in March at the Washington Activity Coordinators Association Annual Conference in Vancouver, Washington. So that's nice news. And in the spirit of middle school, I'm also pleased to announce that Erin Armstrong, who's currently the assistant principal at Liberty High School, has accepted the principal position at Maywood Middle School starting in July. And Erin has a wealth of experience, including starting her career in Issaquah, teaching at Maywood Middle School, but preceding that has many, many more years working in other districts, including Los Angeles and Seattle. I would like to thank Principal Crystal Week for her current and ongoing leadership as the Maywood Middle School principal, and I know that she is excited to support Erin in the transition. So that was announced today, and we're very pleased about that next step as well. Some other news that's happening across the district. Our Bridge to Kindergarten class began on January 16th, and there were 12 students in the afternoon session at Holly Street Early Learning Center. The class is excited to work on kindergarten readiness skills between now and the end of the year and preparing them for all the awesome, amazing things to come their way as they begin kindergarten in the fall. And the focus for this month is about self-regulation, self-calming, and building friendship skills, which are developmentally appropriate. Moving up to the middle school, we are hosting 5th grade welcome meetings for families and students throughout the month of February. And this is an exciting time for the transition from elementary to middle school. And many of our middle school leaders are committed to providing opportunities to have student voice in their schools. So during this month of February, which is Black History Month, students at Beaver Lake, Cougar Mountain, Issaquah Middle School, and Pacific Cascade created lessons that are being taught in homeroom. And these lessons highlight the contribution of current Black leaders. They're also showcasing local leaders. And at Pine Lake and Maywood, I was combining school names for a second. Wow. Students, Pine Lake Middle School and Maywood Middle School, students are sharing important facts about Black leaders during their morning announcements. So just a couple of great examples there. In other news on staff recruitment and growth, we're moving into the phase where we're making those plans for next year. And in February, this month as well, we'll be advertising on movie screens at the Factoria and Crossroads theaters, and we are specifically highlighting the paraprofessional role and opportunities. Based on this particular promotional and marketing tactic, we expect to get 54,000 eyes or views over the course of about 10 weeks. Other HR team members are meeting with the executive director of the Downtown Issaquah Association, Mark Clemens, and we hope that we can collaborate with this community group to post our employment opportunities and promote working at the Issaquah School District on their website as well. And this past week, we've had classified administrators participating in a supervisor boot camp with a very skilled and experienced trainer, and who is very, very popular from what I hear. And this training has been focusing on supporting new supervisors in training and building team around personality types, listening skills, and giving effective feedback and how to manage challenging conversations. I'd like to share a couple updates on breakfast, which is an important topic to meet the basic needs of some of our students. So we continue to make good progress with planning and launching our breakfast pilot at Clark, Issaquah Middle School, and Issaquah High School. So those are the 3 schools that we're starting with. And we're working to build with each building a plan for logistics and communications, and are able to start serving breakfast shortly after we return from the winter break. Many team members have contributed to this effort, and that's pretty powerful. And you can see a sample menu here for just how that will play out over through March. Our special services team is also in collaboration with parents, staff, and community partners through 3 different committees. There is a family and community partnership committee, a strategic planning committee, which is specific to this department and work of special services, and a literacy continuum committee. These committees are focused, these committees are focused on strengthening and deepening family and community partnership, all in support of improving outcomes for students that receive special education services. And I'd like to thank and appreciate Executive Director of Special Services, Shireen Carver, for spearheading these efforts to further engage with families of students who receive special services. Two more final things. So earlier this week, our cabinet did our regular offsite meeting at Liberty High School, where Principal Andy Brownson facilitated classroom visits for our leadership team, focused on Universal Design for Learning CAS guidelines, which means that we were looking for multiple means in classrooms for students to engage, represent what they're learning, and express what they're learning. One highlight for me was to see Liberty High School choir teacher Eric Price in action, who was leading an amazing practice for students. And then finally, this past 2 weeks, our cabinet has been spending significant time preparing for and engaging in strategic planning and budget preparations. And that's been the bulk of our work and a huge focus of our work together with the board moving forward in the next few months. So that's it from my end.
Thank you. Any questions, comments?
I will have questions, but I think I'll place it in the legislative matters because it'll pertain and link to that.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so next up on the agenda, we have updates from our student board representatives, which, let's see, do we have, I see Mia in the room. Do we have Tarang on the Zoom? Awesome. So let's see, tonight our update is all around GP 12.
Wait a minute.
Oh, wait, are we doing yours first? You guys wait. I'm on the wrong one. I get so excited, sorry. It's not to say your birthday. Okay, so this is when we're gonna get an update on the program itself, right? So we're in a new iteration of our student rep program, been active this year. And I will turn it over to Director Weaver, Director Moraldo, any comments about the meetings? And maybe, I don't know if Andrea is here. You have comments, Superintendent? Awesome. About recent updates.
Who wants to start? Okay, we had actually a really good meeting. It was sort of a mid-year update of how are things going, what's going well, what could be going better. And there was a lot of really thoughtful input. I think if I can try to pick up the common themes, there was some confusion about, you know, we'd like to go to more meetings. We don't want to go to all the meetings. How many meetings are we actually supposed to be going to? And so that, I think, is probably a miscommunication on our part that we need to address. Some of the interesting things were that maybe there wasn't quite enough onboarding. Maybe we should have had, you know, another meeting after the first one. Maybe we should have started sooner. Some way of engaging the ASB, because the ASB leaders in the high schools don't really seem to know what the board representatives are doing. And so that's a barrier to effective communication with the student body. I thought that was actually a really good point. And I don't know if the solution is for, you know, to have a board member go and talk to the ASBs or just to bring these two groups of students together. But I thought that was really interesting input. We talked about wanting the students to participate more in the meetings from a board perspective, but we don't have them sitting up here anymore. So when they're sitting in the audience, they're like, well, how would I do that? Right? Am I supposed to raise my hand? What am I supposed to do? And that's a fair point, right? We don't really have that set up. And they talked a little bit about how some of this could have been discussed more in the interview process. Maybe the term should be 1.5 years so that we'd have some overlap and, you know, experienced students mentoring inexperienced students. I think as a board, we got very busy and probably didn't do enough check-ins with the students. That's on us. I think they're not always totally understanding what some of the policies and ELs are really about. And again, that would be more board interaction and mentoring. Again, that one's on us. They would like some kind of a framework or a rubric for what we actually want to see in those reports, because it's really pretty open-ended. And yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, I think this is why I let Suzanne go first, because I knew she took copious notes. But I think the other piece around that is, you know, we asked them for feedback on an EL, and yet then when we're actually addressing the EL, they're not here to participate in that. And so it seems like there's actually 2 meetings per EL that they really would want to be involved in. One about their report is their input really looking at, helping us reflect on what we want to be seeing in the EL. So I think there's some definitely some opportunity there. And I think we didn't have students up here even prior. We haven't had students up on this dais because of COVID. So we pretty much we opened up this towards the end of when COVID came about. So we never really had students up here. So where were we going to place them? And so now is it time that we no longer have the same COVID mitigations? Can we include a student on the dais, and do we create that calendar at the beginning of the year?
And I will just add, and this is food for thought for a more in-depth board discussion, not necessarily here, maybe at a retreat or something, but I think what we're doing is great. I really like the input that the students are bringing to us. I would like it to be more interactive, but it's still not scratching my itch for like having a dedicated student rep who's sitting on the dais, who's participating consistently in board meetings. And I realize that's a big ask to have somebody give up 2 Thursdays a month of their lives to do that. But I still think there's probably the odd student out there who would find that fun. So I think everything we're doing is great. I still think there's another piece to it.
With you saying that, I know with Influence the Choice, our youth board has a chair, right? So they've kind of put somebody, and that person comes to the board meetings. And so is it something similar where you'd want to select 2 students from the broader selection of representatives to be the ones to sit on the board and that are ready and prepared to take on that extra level of participation? So most of the students, and this is something else, I'm glad I thought of it, that somebody had mentioned. So most of our students are very involved in a lot of different activities. So what we would be looking for is really somebody who's choosing this as their main priority activity. What that made me think of was there was another comment made that we seem to be getting the same type of student, right? So the type of student that goes out for a student representative position are the ones that have like 5 activities that are involved in. They're taking all the AP or IB classes. So are we getting a good representation of the student body with who we're selecting? And I think it comes to how can we advertise this opportunity for students that maybe don't have a 3.7 or higher, that we're really reaching and hearing from students from a broader section of our student body.
Yeah, and that advertising piece was another thing that came up among multiple student groups, was that, they only just happened to see it in this one place. And why wasn't it advertised in 15 other places?
They saw it in Canvas.
They saw it in Canvas. Yes, thank you. So, so there's a lot more work to do. As I say, I think the biggest takeaway was we need more interaction between the board and the kids. But also, as Marnie said, how do we, maybe among that group, how do we find 1 or 2 students who would really like to take a deeper dive into what the board does? And all of them expressed still not feeling like they're totally sure about what the board is doing in terms of how do we, what are we doing with all these ELs and everything. That's a fair comment. It took me a while to figure out what we were doing too. But so I thought it was a really helpful, useful meeting, and I appreciated the students all being so open about their concerns and frankly, where we were failing on a fair bit of it.
Superintendent?
Great, just a couple of things. It was a great discussion, so I have nothing to add to what was shared by Director Meralda or Director Weaver. But I want to appreciate the students that did participate in the conversation, which includes Paige, Jordan, Mia, who's here, Sophia, Jack, and Tarang for providing their thought partnership. It was a great conversation. I want to just appreciate and thank Andrea Zier, who is the Executive Director of High Schools, for facilitating the conversation. So we had small group opportunity and then we had whole group share out to identify where there was overlap or differences in the conversations. And we did leave with an offer to revise and provide input by student representatives on GP 12. So as we consider, right, the changes and shifts or what needs to be more explicit for expectations and to get to the interactive relationship, I think there's an offer on the table to provide input there. And I think that's a potentially good next step.
Fantastic. Excuse me. I'm very sad I don't get to have this conversation. So thank you for having them. I think, one of the things that we'd hoped for when we started doing this was this first group would help us better shape and define what it looked like going forward. So that's amazing feedback. That's appreciative. And I take you up on the offer to look at GP at the policy and make sure that we're shaping a program that makes sense, the length of time, the who we're recruiting. And certainly the students will be much better at getting us to how we should be recruiting going forward, for sure. So thank you for that discussion. I will now move to the the item that I thought I was going to cover, which is on student input on EL 12, which is the learning environment. So this is an opportunity for our student representatives to review the policies we're working on. It is worth saying it's a bit of an unusual year as well, because we've been going through a process of both having a new superintendent, taking a step to revise how we look at the policies and their interpretations, and then going through and monitoring them. They'll probably feel a little bit different as we get into next year. So we're doing all the new things. So I think it would be great if we can have feedback. Why don't we start on Zoom maybe with Tarang, since we have Tarang on your input on the learning environment.
Sure. So my name is Tarang. I'm the Skyline student rep. And I circulated a survey among students at my school and, interviewed some of my peers about their satisfaction with the learning environment. So with regards to grading, about 40% of students thought that teachers graded assignments fairly, and 30% of people were quite neutral about it. But there were some specific points that I noticed came up. So for example, some students felt that it was hard for them to do their best at school with some of the grading practices. So some of them felt that there were too many graded assignments, and it's hard for them to really master the concepts that the assignment is on. And others felt that the graded assignments don't even benefit them. So for example, class participation or having Socratic seminars as a part of your grade, it's very intimidating for very shy or introverted people. So they're not able to achieve the best grade that they can get. And also many people felt that teachers did not pass their grade back in time, so they weren't able to receive feedback or things like that to improve their grade over the semester, or even just improve on their own skills. With regards to homework practices, about 40% of people felt that it was relatively manageable, and again, 30% of people were neutral about it. But there was a general consensus that there were times during the school year when there was a very high volume of work, and then other times when there is almost no work at all, and it's really stressed out students. And something else that came up quite a few times was that homework often piles up. And this homework generally seems to be busy work. So students feel that they're not really mastering concepts from class again. And then in terms of accelerated learning, I would say 70% of students felt that they had the opportunities for it, but there were also many students who felt that they were not getting the support they needed from teachers. So some students said that in certain classes, especially block classes where there can be up to 50 people, it was very hard for them to receive individualized feedback. So they weren't able to improve on their learning. And another point that was brought up was that the support that they could receive is not very accessible. It's very hard to get, or their teacher is just not available for them. Then in terms of counselor accessibility, most people felt that they had like access to their counselor, and their counselor was very open and accessible and very approachable as well. But there were students who did request that there were there were opportunities to meet their counselor during flex times or after school, because they didn't want to miss out during in class times for their meetings. Then for the social and emotional learnings, students felt that was like quite well incorporated through flex times. But it did come at the cost of having less accessibility to teachers because, again, as I said before, it was done through a lot of flex times. And some students felt that there were almost too many this year. Other students felt that the SELs, especially about like stress, anxiety, time management, they should have been done earlier in the year and also several times, because they thought that it would really benefit them in their own school experience. And then some other points that came up was with regard to test retake policies. So students felt that it should be more streamlined or fixed across classes, because some teachers allow test retakes whereas others didn't. And then some people felt that the pace of some classes is too fast. So again, they find it challenging to understand the content. And yeah, this is what I gathered about the learning environment at Skyline, and thank you for your time.
I couldn't type fast.
Thank you, Tarang. And I believe you guys, they're all going to send email as well. So we'll have the email copy. Thank you so much for that. Mia, do you want to head up?
Hello, I am Mia Williamson, and I'm a student representative from Liberty High School, and I'm reporting on EL 12 learning environment. Like Tarang, I had a survey sent out to everyone in my school through my wonderful librarian, Miss Gillingham, and it centered around the structure of the EL itself, and basically about how students agreed if this was working or not working in their learning environment. So this EL covers a lot about grading practices and homework, and one of the big things on there is equitability. And one of the big issues that students found with this is that people with IEPs and 504s don't always get the accommodations that they are supposed to have. Sometimes teachers don't look into those, which it's not necessarily their fault if they don't know that the student has an IEP or 504. But if they don't know that and the students don't get their accommodations, they're at a huge disadvantage. And this comes into play especially because categories like assessments are really heavily weighted and determine a grade, which can be good because often these are demonstrations of mastery like the EL stipulates. But oftentimes Socratic seminars, like Tarang mentioned, are highly weighted in these categories. And so people who maybe aren't native English speakers or those with speech disabilities or impediments are at a great disadvantage for something that really impacts their grade. Homework-wise, some people thought that it would be great if teachers could offer a wider variety of paper and online options, because sometimes there's only one of each. And just based on the students' opportunities or maybe what technology they have at home, one or the other is easier for them to do. So providing both can make it more equitable for everyone. The EL stipulates that determination of students' grades should be driven by demonstration of mastery, and that students should have multiple opportunities for this mastery. But students feel like they don't. While they have tests, right, which is their usual demonstration of mastery, at the end of the unit, they show what they've learned. A lot of students don't have the best opportunities for retakes on these tests. Retake policies vary from teacher to teacher, from department to department, to class, and there's not really a lot of consistency in that vein, which I'll touch on later. But because tests matter so much and retake opportunities are often limited, students feel like they're not getting the opportunities owed to them in that arena. Grading and homework consistency. Overall, students said it's very inconsistent. Some classes will have an A- and a B+ and that kind of system, and some classes will just have A's, B's, C's. And you can get a 90% in one class and have an A, and a 90% in another and have an A-, which is really inconsistent, and it happens even in the same course. One example at Liberty is our junior year US history class. And since the majority of juniors take this class, there's a lot of classes, there's 4 teachers, and they all have different lesson plans, different homework, different grading practices. even though it's supposed to be the same course. So that's pretty inconsistent for students. Like my class doesn't have any homework and another has a very large workload. On homework, students feel their homework isn't as meaningful and doesn't contribute to their learning as much as it could. A lot of people see homework either as a waste of time or a grade booster, but not as a tool for learning. They agree that when done right, homework can be a great tool for learning. It can help you practice and cement material learned in class. But for some classes, they feel like homework is a little bit meaningless, or maybe it's not being implemented in the right way. And students just feel like there could be a better connection between their homework and their lessons. Access to non-core opportunities and social emotional learning. Students actually really like Liberty's variety of electives. They feel like we have a lot of great classes that aren't STEM, that offer a lot of opportunities in like performing arts or CTE courses. The only issue is that because of our new schedule change, having one less period makes it a little bit harder for them to take those classes that they really are interested in. And then sometimes the classes fill up, so they don't get to take them. Social emotional learning opportunities are there, but students don't feel like they help them. I'm sure you know how students feel about SEL lessons in our homeroom. A lot of people feel like they're useless. And some people said that they would maybe be more helpful when implemented at an elementary level, because we didn't really have that at that age. And they're pretty simple lessons that we feel like we could have learned earlier on. In regards to access to counseling and mental health supports, students agree that they have their counselors and that they're there, but a lot of people think their counselors aren't especially useful. The counselors try their best, but there are so many students and so little counselors that often you can never see the counselor the day the issue arises. One student said, "The counselors here are always super stressed out and frazzled, and I always feel bad whenever I go in to talk to them," which I think says a lot about how our counselors are doing. Then I asked students what their ideal learning environment would be for their school. And they said they wanted a challenging, focused environment where they really can focus on learning and not just memorization for the tests. They wanted to have a lot of supportive, intense discussions with classmates. And they also wanted teachers to hold them accountable during work time. In regards to homework, they wanted it to reflect their lessons, and they wanted these lessons to be more interactive. Above all, students highlighted that they really needed a flexible, understanding teacher who could meet their learning needs. Then I asked them what they thought the district could do to help with this ideal learning environment that they talked about. And most of the answers, again, centered on teachers. Students just really want passionate, committed teachers who care about their students. When a student feels like a teacher is invested in them, they invest in their learning, and it makes the learning environment so much better for everybody else. Another thing on here that I was excited to see was that a lot of people liked having more student feedback. They wanted more opportunities for students to give feedback to the district and the board, and they wanted to see real change based on that feedback. One student said that a lot of times it might be better to look for feedback outside of district prompted polls or forms. For example, things on social media may have topics that students wouldn't normally talk about in a district-sponsored space. But overall, students felt comfortable in their learning environment. They feel like Liberty is a generally encouraging place for them to learn, and they felt like that although they're very inconsistent, their grading and homework practices make sense overall. Thank you.
Fantastic.
That is just a lot of input. Thank you so much.
Have you shared the librarian idea with the other schools, with the student reps from the other schools? Okay, interesting. Thank you. Great job, Mia. So many notes. Hold on one second. So we had a third student, Nathan, he couldn't be with us, so we'll get his feedback as well. We'll get that in email. Yes, Director Gallinger.
I would request that when we get to agenda planning, because I'll forget this, that's what I'm saying it now. Based on all the feedback we've heard from our students, and this is such a student-focused EL, it would be really great if we could build in a study session, 2 study sessions actually, one that's focused on the grading part and one that's focused on the homework part. And then if we could invite all of our student reps to a roundtable discussion for an hour before our meeting, that would be really helpful. I think for us to hear and have them hear to the point about, hey, they want just more than just a survey feedback, but they've heard enough and they've reached out enough. It'd be great for us to be able to have them participate in that dialogue with our cabinet. So that'd be really helpful before we actually formally monitor EL 12.
Okay, thank you.
Can I briefly want to say I'm really thankful for Tarang had mentioned about students who are introverted and some of the things we're doing in the classroom. And so I think I said probably during our last board retreat over the summer, like, this is my new thing, is that introverted students and how do they feel within our system. So I'm really grateful that it came out. So I'm not the only one thinking that.
Okay. Great conversation. So we are going to move on to actual monitoring of some of our policies this evening. Next up on the agenda is the review of EL 14, instruction. And so I will ask for a motion.
No.
Yes?
No.
This is
no motion.
for instruction?
Yeah, this is just on the interpretation.
Okay. That's a bad copy and paste. Well, we'll do instruction, we'll do the interpretation. The final is previous year? Okay, got it. All right. Superintendent, over to you.
Great. I'd like to also make sure that Dr. Dana Bailey and Rich Mellish are on tap for any additional questions that might come up. So they're available potentially to also answer questions that may arise. I'll just provide a brief overview, just highlighting what changes were made conceptually, because I'm not going to go through the entire document. So I removed references to COVID. Okay. That one was pretty clear. Updated language based on my own personal preference and style for communication and my professional experiences with instruction, and specifically made explicit links to best or evidence-based practices and continuous learning. So ongoing review of whether or not we know things are working and understanding whether or not we need to make changes or adjustments about our work. And then I clarified a few points, which I would call modernizing a few references right within the actual interpretations to different programs, added some linkages also to MTSS and to Universal Design for Learning, and made additional explicit connection to the work that we are doing on trauma-informed practices, culture responsive pedagogy, and implementation and training around high leverage practices. So that's just an overview of some of the changes that kind of are combined throughout the entire document, and eager for feedback on the interpretation or clarifying questions, as well as any, we're looking at the evidence from sort of a new perspective. And so any specific things that are very burning to you all for evidence as we move forward.
Thank you. Board, any discussion? Yes, sure, Director Allen.
My question first is to the board, like, since we're redoing the interpretation, do we get to redo any of the board parts? And specifically bring your attention to which one? Sorry, it refers to the ends, but I thought it should refer to the ends and the ELs. So I'm trying to find which number it was. So you see that
7 refers to the ends.
Yeah, 7.
Okay.
So it seems like 7, it should really say the board's ends and executive limitations both. And now I know it's not your job to do that, but I don't know if that technical fix could be something that we could do as part of this work. And why I say that is because the executive limitations include our equity policy EL 16. And so specifically when we're talking about curriculum or textbook adoption, like we want that to be a strong consideration as part of the work. And so I would just love for that to be linked and brought this together, because that's an important lens by which we want to look at this. And I just didn't see that in interpretation, which your interpretation matches what the board policy is, but we probably should adjust that to update it for what we really have been focused on over the past several years.
Well, I certainly think there is room. I think that's a simple fix in here, but it leads me to a broader point of this entire looking at what our instructional programs are as a whole, and do they meet our equity? Do they meet EL 12? So, about homework and grading that we just heard from our students. So, I think it would be good to have here, but I think there's other pieces more than just selecting our textbooks that would be included in that need to revamp that. So I like that. It's definitely work that the board could do.
It's interesting because it kind of goes back to when we were first developing the equity policy, and we went back and forth. Should it be in the ends? Should it be an EL? And, we finally decided it should be an EL because it needed to be pervasive in all the ends. But then, when we wrote this EL, we weren't thinking about that. So it's a good catch. And Marnie's probably right that we could catch it in a few other places.
Well, I mean, when we wrote this EL, it was specifically because we had a really bad math curriculum adoption issue way back in the day.
Oh, no, we wrote this EL because we originally had an instruction EL.
Took it
was
away.
Monitored in a 4-inch notebook, and we solved the problem by throwing away the EL.
Yes. And then we had
And
a
then we
curriculum
had
adoption, which we went,
horrible curriculum
well, we
adoption
have
and went,
no way of saying no.
we should have an EL. It was a traumatic policy governance experience.
So
Because Marnie and I wrote this EL with Emily Hard.
hence the discussion.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, but maybe back to the premise you just brought up, Suzanne, which is, do we need to mention the ELs and ends in every policy? Is that the correction?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think we need to review the ELs through that lens and see if there are places where it would be appropriate. I mean, we don't reference the ends necessarily in all the ELs, but it wouldn't be that difficult. I'm going to say this, I'm going to end up volunteering to do it. I can hear it in my head.
So can I?
But I should just
Trying to
not
walk her
talk.
to it. I'm just trying to walk her to it. Like, what do you think that would be,
Just not talk.
Suzanne?
But yes, we could read through the ELs and see if there were other places.
I think that's a fantastic idea. Director Weaver, thank you for doing that work on behalf of the board.
I will add that this was, I thought about that along the way, but this actually was the first one where I had a similar thought, Director Gallinger. So when I said the words of modernizing the language, it was really about, boosting to match a little bit more of what we're doing and referring to current practices and programs. So would welcome that conversation as well.
Fantastic. Did you have comments, additional ones with that as well, Director Gallinger?
I'll volunteer to help you.
Oh,
Well, if we're going to take a look at this, I'm confused. No, I will say no. Even the first one about maintaining a management system that ensures challenging and relevant opportunities. And I'm not sure that this is a management system. So I'm confused as how Suzanne and I came up with that language in the first place.
Which number are you on?
It's the very
The very
first top sentence.
management system.
And it's good that we go through these interpretations. It gives you time to really delve through and go, what was I trying to say with this? And I'm not sure what I was trying to say with a management system, because that just seems odd. So while you're looking at it, that's another area of interest. No, but I do appreciate some of the interpretation changes, some more details around what is meant, going back to the Washington State learning standards. And so I think I think there's some more specificity in here that I appreciate.
So then number 11, so share with the board on an annual basis, data-driven plans for improvement at each school. And again, I don't know if so our superintendent's proposed interpretation meets that, but for me, I would love for it to have said something about beyond where it says alignment with evidence-based strategies for accelerated learning and opportunity gap closure is the so what big picture part of alignment with our strategic plan or alignment with our goals or our benchmarks or whatever big ticks on the ruler. But it doesn't say that in our policy wording. And so this is where, again, for this dance, should it say, share with the board on an annual basis, data-driven plans for improvement at each school and how it relates to either board ends or how it relates to our strategic plan. That may be dated, stale language if we did that. But I think what's always bothered me is we have an amazing SIP plan process, and we do a really poor job, in my opinion, of bringing it all together. And how do they coherently work together to accomplish the board and district's collective goals? And I think this would be where but the district is doing what they're asked to do because it doesn't spell it out in policy. And so again, this would be the one, again, is this a simple technical fix? Because the interpretation as is meets the standard, but since we're talking about interpretation, this is our chance to also talk about, well, how do we actually drive better alignment with the system objectives rather than the individual school objectives? Does that make sense?
I'll also say on number 12, I think spelling out all of those items that you did under technology, because we used to have a whole ends dedicated to technology, and we've changed that. So I think we're capturing a lot of that because the technology is not only as classes, but it's been how it gets integrated into everything. It does help that we're identifying that these things need to be part of our instructional programs.
Right. And it's not technology for technology's sake. It's got very specific goals of what the technology is supposed to do, which I think is important. I agree with you.
And my last comment is on number 5 for the evidence part. So I think for me, when I see encourage new and innovative programs based on research, carefully monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of all such programs, this is where I would like to see evidence on our adoption of the dyslexia curriculum and our early intervention work, as well as inclusion in our inclusion work. And that's for me where I would like to see. We've done a lot of effort and it's been a lot of lift for our team to do that. So like and that was based on researched best practices. So what is the actual impact? Is there an impact? And that's where that would belong for me. I know historically in the previous report, it's been about our innovation with Gibson-Eck and all these other things, but I really want to bring it down to the stuff that we're doing. Like Gibson-Eck's not kind of old news, right? I mean, so now it's like, what is it that we're doing that's directly relevant over the past couple of years?
Well, and I would say with Gibson-Eck is, I don't know where we've really had discussions as a board about the effectiveness of the program. I think it's in its 6th year. To be able to really take a look now that we've had several students that have come through the whole system, where are they at? How is the school doing? I think those are some good conversations. And what pieces of project-based learning can we integrate into other areas? How are we building the skill sets of doing project-based learning with our other staff members that are integrating? Students have projects, but are they learning to the same level and the same depth in those? So how does that get integrated throughout the system?
Right, because when Gibson-Eck came online, it was with the hope of this conceptually and this innovative work would be infused within our comprehensive high schools. And I don't feel that necessarily has, but I could be shown to be proven that I'm wrong.
Do we have other comments? I have one. I guess for me, it's number 13. on the transitional bilingual instruction program. I guess I just maybe don't, I feel like this interpretation could be more direct. I'm actually not sure what it means that will get implemented.
I'll just say this was such a specific program, and we have other programs that support bilingualism as well as students whose language might be a primary language other than English in their home or what they're coming to us with. So this felt like for example, a mismatch between maybe the original intent of this. I don't know. I'm looking for the date that it was created, but this is such a specific program. I think we have other offerings that support multilingual learners. So that was the intent behind that shift in the interpretation, was to name the work and support we're doing for dual language, as well as supporting our other learners. That was the intent, but yeah.
Yes.
Well, I was going to say, I think what you might be feeling though is that maybe our bullet point is not deep enough. So we simply are saying, assure the implementation of this program. Is it that we want that, or do we want something more robust? We want it to be there's a successful one is probably, or that in which students are gaining an understanding to be able to do their other work, so that this program allows them to be successful students in all their classes, or there's something more there, I think.
Right. There definitely seems like there's something more there. And I think if maybe in the multilingual learning program, I guess that phrasing is used to create an umbrella, I guess is what you're saying, for multiple different programs that could occur or be put into place. And dual language is one example.
I have a recollection of when we wrote this, that this was a really specific legal requirement of something. And we put it in there because, this is something we have to do. But at the time, well, dual language didn't exist. I mean, in our district, we had ELL certainly, but so this may be a bit of an outdated bullet point, or maybe this is just a bullet point with a lot of specificity, and we need some other bullet point that addresses multilingualness. That's not a word.
Multilingual learning program.
Yeah, multilingual learning, in a more broad context.
Mm-hmm.
And we have Rich. It's going to make sense of that.
Because we just hit submit on our consolidated program review, I am very familiar with the fact that, yes, indeed, this sentence as it is stated is important for us to show compliance with the state. So you could add to this sentence if you wanted more descriptors, but it's really helpful to keep this sentence because we use it as evidence that you are ensuring that we are complying with the state law around the TBIP, which does include our ELL programs. The TBIP does not include the dual language. So by adding that into the interpretation, that is expanding it a little bit beyond the literal language of the EL statement.
So should we, I'm just asking your opinion, should we broaden the sentence, the bullet point, or should we just add a fourth bullet that addresses multilingual learning in more general terms where we could talk about dual language?
The way that I read the interpretation, the evidence we'd bring you would hopefully show the efficacy of our multilingual learning program and our dual language program. Okay. Is the way that I read the interpretation. That's
true. So she's interpreting more than what we meant, but probably what we want.
Well, I think, and which all this makes sense, because I think the thing I'm reacting to in the interpretation is it just strikes me unusual that we're saying, according to state and federal regulations and current research-based professional practices. So it's like, we're going to comply with the base law, but do amazing things on top of that. Is that what we're trying to say? And so for me, it might be better to talk about how we comply with the law as a separate thought from how we do additional multilingual learning programs, because it reads like a hedge to me. I'm going to comply with the law and potentially do something amazing on top of it. So I guess that's
Well,
But
and that's
I
why
didn't
I was
understand.
saying from a board perspective, should those be two
Should
separate
they be two
thoughts?
separate thoughts? Yeah. I think, for me, I think that would make more sense. And yes, I'm trying to do it in the interpretation, but to the point of the earlier discussion, we probably need to do it in the
But I do,
policy.
I do think two different thoughts, but in the same bullet point, because I don't want to have like, here's our our trilingual program, but then here's this other stuff about other or
Right.
English language learner programs. I think I'd still want to see them all in one bullet point, but
And maybe it's that
specifying.
we're gonna meet regulation and
And-
exceed by
Yeah.
doing X, Y, and Z would
Yeah.
maybe help. But I was like, what are we doing in that one? Okay, any other comments on this one, at this interpretation?
I mean, what this says to me is her interpretation is fine, but as a board, we should be thinking about reframing that sentence. Yeah, okay. I'm not volunteering.
I think you already did.
Thanks, Pam did it. I'm so sure I didn't.
Dr. Director Callinger.
For 3 and 4, when I go and look back at what the previous evidence that's always been provided to us, I think it's still in the scope of the traditional average student and what they may, over the course of their study, be interested in doing. And I think what we heard through our listening sessions is there is a desire amongst the community and our student body that we really need to focus on expanding our alternative learning pathways or truly increase in maybe even revisit what we think about for a career and technical education, because we don't have, even though we're a WANIC district, we don't have like Washington Technical Institute within our boundaries. Like there are, like, we do not, if you are a student at Skyline High School and you decide you want to be an electrician or a plumber or an auto mechanic, maybe there's just a high school in our district that you can do that at, and I'm not aware of it. But I think that for me, when it talks about ensure that the instructional program includes opportunities for students to develop talents and interests in more specialized areas, like we're missing that really important piece. And this is where policy does really drive practice. And because all of our policy and then all the evidence that's been provided has been like, oh yeah, we offer all these electives. But I think it would be great for us to have some insight in what we're not offering and what particular interests of students that they're not being served. And so I don't care whether that belongs in 3 or in 4, because 4 is ensure that the instructional program addresses the different learning styles and needs of students of various backgrounds and abilities. For me, it could fit in either, but I feel like we don't talk about that enough. And this is probably the place where we need to start talking about it. Like, how are we going to say we're going to serve and support every student? Because right now we serve and support every student who fits in well with our curriculum that we deliver.
I so agree with everything you just said. I think I would prefer it under number 3, because I think number 4 is very much more about learning styles, especially when I'm thinking of students who would do better with a project-based learning as opposed to the sit and get that they get. But I do think that, we don't have a skills center. Students don't have any means, if you're all the way down at Liberty, you're not going to be able to go to, well, I don't think anyone really, maybe Skyline, you'd get to Lake Washington Institute, but it's so far. You can't take the 1 or 2 or 3 classes and then get back into your class day. You're missing out on other learning. And unless you have, way more time or a dedicated, this is where you go. So we don't have a skill center, and students can't come out with any type of certification. So we don't have kids that can come out as, the certified nursing assistants or a dental assistant or going into an apprenticeship as an electrician or a plumber. And those are things that we really do need. Those are opportunities for some truly living wage jobs for students. And especially for students, we still have a third of our students that do not go off to a 4-year college. And so if they're graduating from high school, and that may be the extent of their education, how are they coming out where they still have the capability to earn a living wage at a job? shortly after school, because they're going to have very little experience in being able to go out into the workforce. And they likely, a lot of them have families that can't afford college to the extent that others can. So housing conditions are going to be different, housing opportunities. And so what are we doing so that they have a place to be landing, getting a certification that can really lead them to good career opportunities?
Because it isn't just what we have to deliver. It can be like what in through partnership with Renton Technical College. So, but I think that we need to think more broadly about how we're serving students in ways that we haven't thought about, but certainly the community has asked us to think about. So I think it's incumbent on us to do that. Number one. And number two is, how could this potentially impact what high school number 4 looks like? And that's why this is a really important time for us to talk about it. Because if there's a needs assessment that shows like, hey, we have X number of students in a given year that wants this type of hands-on apprentice-based learning beyond Gibson Act and in a more formalized, specialized setting, then like we should think about how we could deliver that.
Yes.
When we got into 3 and 4, this reminded me that I had a question about 4, which was when we originally put that together, I was viewing different learning styles and needs of students as things like, I'm a visual learner, I'm an auditory learner, this student learns differently than that student. And it's sort of the type of thing that I think the GLAD program tried to target, the different needs of students. And this interpretation dives into MTSS. Now, is MTSS designed to do that as well? I interpreted that more as student supports to like bring them up to standard or whatever, but I'm thinking of kids who are at standard or above standard. They don't all learn the same, right? Some kids, if you give them something to listen to, they're lost. Other kids, can't do it visually. So I don't know if that one's scratching my itch.
I can share from, thank you for that feedback. That's helpful to also understand the origin and intent, because it's very helpful background. I think potentially the sort of leading point maybe here should be around universally designed instruction, because universally designed instruction would actually account for, in theory, especially in tier 1, academic and behavioral learning needs would be, and this is actually what I touched upon with the example from Liberty High School visit with our cabinet, which is that you have multiple ways within a class time to be able to express your learning, to access the learning, and to take into account the various needs within the classroom for modality, visual, auditory, et cetera, within that one setting in that class in that chunk of time. So in theory, that would be, and maybe this is sort of a sequencing issue, right, in how this is represented. But in theory, that would be addressing the different learning needs and different styles and different interests. It's also about interest, voice and choice, in addition to learning style, preferred mode of also expressing what you're learning, whether it's doing a poem or writing an essay or doing a verbal presentation. Those are different modes of also expressing learning. Thank you for the feedback. I can make that more clear.
Any other comments or feedback? I just think, and maybe if we go back to the previous conversation, one thought that came to mind as you were just going through that is it's more of maybe it's an evidence comment I want to make, which is on this point of post high school opportunities, whether apprenticeship or other technical programs. I feel like in previous conversations, we've heard a lot about students having the high school and beyond plan, and that high school and beyond plan incorporates plans besides 4-year university. And so I guess what I just want to make sure is, as we talk about how we can demonstrate what we're talking about, that the act of having a high school and beyond plan that says I want to do something other than a 4-year college isn't the same as having the opportunity to actually act on the thing that gives me the real plan beyond high school. So that's maybe the worry that went through my head, to be like, oh, well, people can say students can indicate that they have other plans besides 4-year college, but do we practically have the programs behind that that make that real, like access of an apprenticeship or access of like the skill center, culinary programs or other things like that. So I just had to get that out of my head before I forgot it. Okay, is that enough feedback on the interpretation?
All super, super helpful, as well as the discussion on monitoring evidence. So thank you. Also, thank you to Director Weaver and Director Moore for tackling some of the actual EL language as well. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Funny man.
So funny. I wasn't going to go back there. I had said my words of appreciation. Okay, so our next topic. Now we're really going to monitor because I pasted in the wrong place before. For EL1.
Oh, did you want to do public input? Yeah, on EL 14.
Which is why I thought I knew the wrong. I can call for it. So that's it. We have to look at some of these comments in each agenda item on exactly what we're doing. But yeah, happy to ask for public input on EL 14 and instruction. Is there any in the room? Is there any on Zoom? Thank you. All right, let's go on to EL1 and the monitoring of executive constraint. Do I have a motion?
Sure. I move the board accept the monitoring report for EL1 Global Executive Constraint Internal as presented.
Second.
Thank you. Superintendent, over to you and the team.
Just one comment, which is this is being put forward again to the board for action with an exception, and that exception has been noted with underlined text.
Okay, no additional presentation. Okay, so why don't we do this? I would like to see if there's any public comment on this topic before we have our discussion. So is there any public comment on this agenda item, which is the monitoring of EL1 executive constraint? Anyone in the room? Anyone on the Zoom? No, thank you. And we will go on with board discussion.
I think I'd ask that you then put in parentheses or indicate that the exception is the underlying text. Because while I was looking for it and knew what it was, someone from the public would not understand or make that correlation.
You just want it to say with an exception, which is underlined below.
Perfectly fine.
Okay.
Something that simple, but just because I was presuming that's what the exception was. But even without you saying, until you said that, I didn't actually know for sure.
Any other comment or discussion?
Okay, that doesn't need to be considered an amendment, does it?
Can it just be printed with, or with? when it's
No, I just
published?
mean in terms of the motion, do I have to redo the motion to say we accept it as amended? It's
Not a Robert's
It's a pretty
rule, but-
minor change. I don't know. I defer to our experts.
Yeah, you could consider that an amendment, and then somebody could second, that way would add that verbiage. And I mean, the cleanest way to do it is to say that we would like to add.
Yeah, except it's not our report.
But we're gonna accept it. You're right. You didn't have to send to it, but otherwise you could bring it back.
I wouldn't want her to bring it back.
No.
The proposal could be as amended with, in parentheses, see underlined text. I think that was what the
Okay.
sentiment behind Director Gallander's point was, in the to follow the words with an exception, parentheses, see underlined text.
So. Okay, so I want to withdraw my original motion. Can I do that?
Yes.
Yes.
Make a new motion that says, I move the board accept the monitoring report for EL1 Global Executive Constraint Internal as amended to add the words in parentheses as underlined below
Mhm.
after the words with an exception.
Okay, second. And to be clear, I'll go back to your withdrawn and I agree. 'Cause I think as the second, I needed to agree. So
Okay,
I
that's
agree to the
probably true.
withdraw and I second the new motion.
Wonderful. So we have a new motion because we withdrew the first one, so we don't have to do an
Mhm.
approval of the amendment. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 That was any against? No. Okay. All right, that report is accepted. Thank you. We do. That's why I had my rogue copy and paste. Okay, so next we have on the agenda the monitoring report for EL10 structure of schools. Do I have a motion?
I move the board accept the annual internal monitoring report for EL10 structure of schools as presented.
Second.
Thank you, Superintendent.
So first, thank you to Mayor and Trong, also providers of input on this EL, the first meeting in January. Our focus here has been to be concise in our evidence to support interpretation, and that's what we approached this executive limitation monitoring report with, that intent.
Thank you. Let's see, we also have an opportunity for public comment on this topic. We can see if there's a call for. Is there anyone in person who would like to give input on the monitoring report for EL10 structure of schools? Anyone on Zoom? Okay, thank you. We can move to board discussion. Any discussion on this one?
Well, I guess I'll start.
Thank you.
Top of page 3, the paragraph that starts with middle school advisory. So the EL is number 3, select bell times that meet district and state requirements while considering students' instructional parentheses academic needs, co-curricular and extracurricular activities, and health and well-being at a reasonable cost. So I'm not confident that middle school advisory is truly doing that. So as an effective use of our students or our staff's time. And so certainly, can they do the SEL lessons in that time period? They can. But the overwhelming majority of that time, at least in my child's middle school, is not time that's instructionally based or focused. And so I'm not convinced that that's evidence that's applicable to this. And I know that Director Mullins also has a middle school student, so, and has had one recently as well, as I have. So in my 4 years of middle school, I don't see that as a valuable use, and do believe that it should be restructured to probably look more like how flex time is utilized in our high schools. Because while flex time is utilized for SEL, we heard from our students, there is still a lot of student choice and support time built in. And advisory in middle schools is just frankly not a good use of the time. And part of it is because it's not a long enough time to be considered meaningful. So we've had multiple conversations over the years, we being the board, on the utilization of that and how our middle school schedule looks. But since you've never been part of that, I wanted to elevate that here.
I'm not sure I'm understanding what you're saying. Are you saying that the advisory period itself is problematic, or are you saying that it is not effectively delivering SEL lessons?
Probably both, but it wasn't, the intent was about it not delivering effective SEL lessons. That's probably more curriculum rather than time-based. But yes, that is not effective use of the time.
It's funny that we're all focused on this one, because when I read it, this is really about bell times, which is really about the start and end of school. And the balance, considering the academic, the co-curricular, extracurricular, it was all about when we were looking at bell times and changing bell times and whether students had adequate time after school to have these other activities. So, I mean, I thought the whole thing was interesting that there was such a focus on SEL as the evidence.
Well, that's because there's a reference to health and well-being.
Well, there is,
Yeah.
but in reference to the bell times.
I take bell times as not just the start and stop time of school. Bell times is like the schedule. So for us in high school, it's the 7-period modified block schedule. And what that means of going 7 periods on Monday, Thursday, Friday, and the modified block on Tuesday, Wednesday with flex time. And that schedule itself is what creates what we hope is opportunity for
Right. So to me, that goes beyond bell times. Now it's referencing schedule, which we refer to, like schedule configurations.
Right, but those are significant ones.
Oh, I know. related to that change. but
Which
the
in a
difference
way,
between bell
it
times and
was a significant change to add the flex times that I don't know that necessarily that specifically came before the board. But I do think again, it goes back to, is there board work to add a bullet? Now that we have flex times, we don't have an area in which to address
Right.
the schedule within a school day and its usefulness on how it's broken up, whether it's, will we get a chance to look at how we have done our 7-period block schedule to be able to see, is that effective learning for students? Are the SEL times that are being pulled out, are those minutes that are being spent really providing the academic information, whether it be social, emotional, that's still an academic, you're learning something. So are students utilizing that time to learn or increase their skills and their mastery of the subjects that they're looking at? And that's, time to take retakes, all of that's embedded in that. And I don't know that we have an area to put that in. And so I think that putting it here is trying to scratch an itch, but it's that we actually have a broader place we need to ask the question.
Well, I'm purely no response. I would say it goes here because I'm purely responding to the superintendent's first sentence, right? Her first sentence says, I interpret this to mean that the district has bell times and daily schedules that meet the state requirement. Like, so in her first sentence, she references the daily schedule and then uses evidence about the daily schedule. So that's why I'm bringing this up. So that's based on the superintendent's interpretation.
I
and the evidence support.
absolutely appreciate that you're bringing it up. I'm saying that it might be that we have additional work to do as a board to include a place to put that, but I agree that she's identifying it that way.
No, I think this is another case of where the superintendent's interpretation went ahead of where we are to where we should be. Because I do think, to Anne's point, that when we wrote this number 3, we were in the teeth of trying to start high school and middle school later, and we were referencing bell times as basically start and stop times. Now, I totally take your point that we should also be talking about schedule, but I don't think that we actually have a bullet in here that does that. We probably should. And no, I'm not going to write it.
Well, you just say and select bell times and daily schedule. It's really adding 3 words. Which would just align with the superintendent's interpretation. I think you have the capacity to add the right 3 words.
So maybe my question is, but would adding those 3 bullets or those 3 words to the policy, I still think there's further you're going in your commentary, right? On the actual qualitative use of the time So I think I hear you on adding the 3 words, but I think there's also another piece that you're getting to, right? So I wouldn't want to lose that.
Well, I think what I'm seeing is that in the evidence is a statement, we do these things, but not an analysis of we do these things and they're impactful and effective.
Yeah. Well, and then there's also, if we go back to student input on this one from last meeting, is it consistent? Is it the actual experience in the day, right, of how the periods are used? They may exist. So I think there is an additional piece that is not included in the interpretation of I guess the impact of these being in place, right? So then what?
And I guess I didn't hear your opinion as a parent of a middle schooler and a former recent middle schooler on the use of the time.
Yeah, I mean, as a parent, it's probably an interesting point. I think in my house, it's been more of an organizing moment in the day. Like, how do they make sure they're organized, which has worked well. I think it's a different question whether the delivery of SEL in that time period has been effective. That's a slightly different question. But we've never had a concern. For each of mine, it's been a helpful organizing moment in the day. Like, how are they actually going to execute in the building against their classes? Could it be used differently or better? Maybe, but that one has never been a conversation for us on the parent side. So what do we want to offer here? Are we offering are we asking for the need for additional detailed information? Are we asking to table until we can do some work on the actual policy? Is there a request in the conversation?
The policy work will take a little bit more because we can't just add those 3 words. We can't have the superintendent select bell times and daily schedules.
Right.
When down below, we say the superintendent shall not change secondary school building schedule configurations. So we have to have those in alignment, but maybe where you're really going is you're looking for the evidence that says this advisory time is actually producing the results of effectively delivering these SEL lessons, because you're questioning the effectiveness of the use of that time.
Yeah, beyond just SEL. And so for me, I'm rejecting that evidence as valid evidence for me personally. And that's all I was saying. I don't really care about the words in the policy. I only brought that up because you brought up the point about how, like, well, where does this, like, this is about daily schedule. And I'm like, well, the superintendent's interpretation brings up daily schedule. And that's why I'm talking about it as evidence. So I'm not asking for anything further from the board or any more inquiry. I'm just saying that I'm rejecting it as evidence and giving my input. That's all. It doesn't have to land any differently than.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Much as I hate to say it, I actually don't really like the idea of just adding 3 words to the policy, because I think bell times as start and stop of the day and daily schedules are very different things. And so I think there should be a number 4 around daily schedule.
So I would agree with that. I think also what I would do is take the part where it says accordingly, the superintendent may not change basic grade level configures, make significant changes. I would put that before getting to those bullets around bell times and daily schedules, because that would be a furthermore, right? So it was like, accordingly, the superintendent can't make these changes without approval of the board. Furthermore, any bell time selected, any daily schedule selected should. So it's actually pretty significant work that probably needs to be done. So I'd like us to kind of schedule that to make sure that by next year, this time, We're not going, oh yeah, we were going to write those.
So then, oh, sorry.
This has been a helpful discussion and good input, and also a reflection of the impact of shifting interpretation, right, around, and going through multiple conversations, right, with others to inform that as well. So in my mind, this was really about making sure that we're minimizing the interruptions so that we can have optimal and maximal use of the day to ensure that we're meeting the multiple needs of our students. And it felt more structural to me, but I think we did blend in a little more programmatic elements here. So I would also be happy to take this back and consider that evidence a bit differently in light of this conversation as well.
And then I have one more around the very first one around unnecessary teacher time out of classroom. We used to get more reports of not just teacher absences, but more teacher absences because they're doing something else. So teacher absences because they're doing a curriculum adoption or they're working on this committee. And I'd love to get some information less about teachers that are absent because that just happens. But when we're pulling teachers out for other things that go beyond just they were sick or they're on leave. Because those are some of that's what I think is meant by unnecessary teacher time out of the classroom. And I don't know that it's addressed in the evidence of compliance.
Right, more about the time where teachers might be pulled out for curriculum work, or
Right.
some other trainings or some other kind of
Right.
work where they're in the build, they're somewhere in the system. They're just not in the classroom.
Yes, they're not in the classroom. And students then have a substitute teacher that's not able to provide the same level of instruction to the students. And how often is that happening? Because I would hear from my kids that was happening very often. And I know you have a sentence in there about when you do, first non-student days, but I think really what are those opportunities that teachers aren't in the classroom? And I'd love to get some evidence around that.
So I hear your offer to rework on the evidence. I guess the thing I want to just make sure we talk through is that relook at the evidence is on the policy as it exists today, obviously not on the policy that we have to rewrite. And so we're in the same place
Right.
that we're
Yeah.
taking a nod toward current view of policy. So I think that probably requires us pulling back our motion.
My emotions are going nowhere tonight. I don't know. I should stop doing this. I would like to withdraw my motion.
And
I
agree.
will second because I'm the one that.
That one, not me.
She did.
There you go.
And involuntary Marnie and I to rewrite EL twin.
Yeah, awesome.
Thanks. I love that. Thank you. Thank you all around. Good conversation. Yeah, there was a lot of motions in here tonight. And I was like, they're not going. Okay.
You're gonna have to you have to withdraw the next
We're not
one
done.
too, I assure you.
Okay, so we will thank you for that discussion. Move on to our next topic, which is high school graduation requirements for the class of 2027. Do I have a motion?
I move the board adopt the graduation requirements for the class of 2027 at Gibson Eck, Issaquah, Liberty, and Skyline High Schools as presented.
Second.
Superintendent, over to
Okay,
you.
great. So we wanted to provide a little more information on some of the graduation waiver details as context for part of this. So Executive Director of High Schools, Andrew Zero, is here to present on this. And please know that this presentation will be uploaded within 24 hours to our website as well. So yeah, Zero.
Getting there. There we go. All right. I better stick to what I know. For the sake of everybody. Yeah, I'm good.
Great, thank you.
I also know what I'm talking about, so I don't think I need to look at it too much. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to just go through the graduations. So the purpose for this is just to review the graduation waivers that are available to all of our current ISD high school students. And so that is the elective waivers, the GRU waivers, which is the waivers that came from COVID, as well as a few other waivers that are available to those students. So the elective waivers have been in place when that changeover to Core 24 came into play. And so essentially there is guidance from RCWs and WACs, and it's captured in our district regulation 2418, which really allows students who have unique circumstances and may have had the inability to accrue all of their credits to waive up to 2.0 electives. This waiver does not allow them to waive subject area requirements. So as you know from our Core 24, they have 17 required core subject area requirements: math, social studies, science, etc., and then some choice electives there. So this does not allow them to waive any of those core area subjects: English, social studies, math, science, things like that. It's electives only for getting up to that total of 24. When students apply for this waiver with their counselors, they have to cite the circumstances that led them to not be able to complete those credits. And there is not a specific code to track this waiver. So really pulling the data on this is just looking at students who graduated with less than 24 credits and overlaying that with anyone who also accessed GRU. Students can combine this waiver with a GRU waiver. So they can get both an elective waiver and a GRU waiver for the students that are in the eligible classes, cohorts for GRU waivers, which I'll talk about in a minute. GRU waivers is the next part here. So in accordance with that WAC there, you see we established our GRU waivers in accordance with that WAC when this came out for those students that were impacted by COVID. So the GRU waiver is for students in the class of 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023, as well as 2024 is also captured in the GRU waivers, but they get less. So those classes 2020 through the current class of 2023 can waive up to 2.0 credits, and that can be in an elective area or a subject area. So this is where it extends it to being able to waive a math, a science, a social studies, and English, etc. However, while it's 2 credits that are available to them, they can't get any waiver above 1.0 in any one subject area. So they couldn't get a waiver for 2.0 in, say, math, but they could get a 1.0 in math and a 1.0 in language arts to get a total of 2, but no more than 1.0 in one particular subject column. The class of 2024 is the last class that's currently eligible for GRU waivers, but they are only able to waive 1.0 credits rather than the 2, and that again can be in any subject area or an additional elective. These students, it does show, and there is evidence of this on their transcript with a V grade. These are the only waivers that are identifiable on transcripts. The elective waivers and the other waivers that I'll go over in a minute are not visible on transcripts, only these ones, and it's captured with a V code. The other waivers that are available to our students is a Washington State history waiver. So as you know, students have to have Washington State history in our state in accordance with the WAC to be able to graduate. But students who move here starting in their junior or senior year are eligible to waive Washington State history because it's so late into their high school career to be able to fit that into their courses. Or if they moved here from another state at any point in time and already completed the state requirement in another state. And then students are also able to waive PE. They can waive PE on account of either a disability, a religious belief, or participation in athletics or military science. I've got some data for you. You can see here the GRU waivers from the class of 2021 and 2022. And you can see there that the GRU waivers went down already. So further away we are from COVID, the fewer students are in need of those GRU waivers. And then also I've captured on here the students, the total number of students from each high school in the classes of 2020, 2021, and 2022 who graduated with any less than 24 credits. So that would be a combination of students who maybe were accessing those elective waivers, GRU waivers. And so you can kind of get a sense by backwards math, I guess, about how many students are accessing some of those other waivers. I'll leave that up there just for a second because it's a lot of numbers.
It's very different among the different high schools, which is kind of interesting.
Particularly in the under 24.
That's what I was looking at. Like,
Yeah.
if you look at 2021, the kids with under 24 credits, it's a big difference among the high schools.
Well, you're right. And when she puts the percentages up.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant with by percentage.
Yeah.
Do you want me to leave this up for a bit longer? I can go back to this at the end if you need me to.
Well, that's okay. I was just thinking because, we had different graduation requirements for the kids at the different high schools because Liberty's had with the 4x4 block had a higher number of credits. And this is still just graduating with less than 24 credits.
Mhm.
So that out of the potentially,
That you have 10% of Liberty students that graduated with less than 24 credits when they had 32 credit opportunities.
yes,
So
yeah.
just a couple other notes and reflections on the waivers is that all students do have the ability to decline any of these waivers. We never force a student to get a waiver in order to graduate with their class. Those students, if they'd prefer not to access a waiver and continue to access classes in a fifth or even further until the law that requires everyone to age out at 21, they can do that. And some students did choose to do that. Waivers do not impact GPAs. They're not calculated into the GPAs. There's no course that's calculated in. So none of these have an impact on the student's overall GPA. Students accessing GRU waivers do need to have made a good faith effort to have been on track and access their courses. Sometimes we get students who are not able to and not have been on track or way behind. They wouldn't be able to access those. They would have had to have a reasonable plan to have attempted those courses by the end of their senior year. There is sort of the potential increased graduation rate with GRU waivers, but that's really hard to measure because of what I just spoke about, which is that students really were expected to have been on track and had a plan to be enrolled in those things. So the whole intent of this was COVID impact. So it's really hard to measure, if COVID hadn't been around and how that impacted students' social emotional well-being, their ability to access their classes when we were in remote learning. It's really hard to say how many of those students would or would not have been successful had COVID not been impacting their learning. That's just hard to measure. It's also really hard to measure, I think, the end of COVID impacts. So that's been a discussion along when do we phase out of GRU waivers? As you see, they're reducing it to the class of 2024 being only eligible to access the 1.0 rather than the 2.0. But, we know our students in middle school were impacted by COVID as well. And that academic and social emotional impact, how long does it take to phase out? So it's just something we're keeping an eye on as we work through this. And that is it.
And who's determining what happens with the next class? So for 2025, is that information we're just given?
We have some advocacy. The State Board of Ed does the Zoom listening sessions and things like that. And we participate in those. I know that was we participated in the one about the discussion of whether class of 2024 should even be included or not. And so at this point, I'm not sure where the discussion is as far as timeline for anything beyond 2024, but it does happen at the State Board of Ed.
Were you going to cover any more on the actual grad requirements, or that was the?
Nope.
Okay.
That's just because there's no changes from last year. So I didn't think there's anything new. I'm always happy to answer questions if you had any, but no, I wasn't intending to.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to see if there's any public comment on this topic before we have a discussion. Any public comment on this grad requirements topic in the room? Or on Zoom? Okay, thank you. Discussion from the board. Questions?
Okay, I guess I'll start. So there may be another venue on our board calendar for how and when this would be appropriate conversation, but I don't know where it is, so I'm going to start it here. Now, having a high school student, my whole view of these is a little different. But what I've discovered And through, I think, a lot of our homework and grading work and hearing about some of the challenges at some of our schools for, surprises about how homework and grading has to be implemented at Issaquah High School and which departments were more impacted than others, has led me to think about, and we had board conversation about this as well already, on what is the role of credit, no credit, or pass fail, or whatnot. So can you give us what the State Board of Education guidance is on that for both core and non-core 24 credits? And why this matters is because I feel like we should be able to articulate that to our students and help address the stress that they're feeling for some of their courses.
So pass-fail grading is something that lives in a couple of areas. So sometimes it lives on a student's IEP or 504 that says that that's part of their accommodations, that they can access that for any of their classes. And when that's the case, it's sort of on the onus of the IEP time or the IEP team or the 504 team to discuss like when that makes sense for each of the classes. And it's a discussion among the whole IEP team and the 504 team. For students who are not served with a 504 or IEP, it is something that is sometimes part of the course guide. So for example, a student who takes a TA class to TA in the office, it's written in the course guide when they select that as one of their classes, that's just pass-fail grading, because there aren't really clear academic standards around being an office TA. And so it's predetermined based on the course guide. That's for very few classes. Really, it's mostly like being a TA. And then if they're in a, say, core academic class or elective, there's really no difference between when they access pass-fail grading as a student who's not served with an IEP or 504 between an art elective or an art that's part of their 17 graduation requirements out of the core 24, or math or science. It's all the same for any class. It's usually a conversation between the teacher and the student. Most often it really is the teacher's discretion if the student isn't served with a 504 IEP. And most often our teachers are using that for students on, say, like an academic contract. So if the student is really close on that bubble of a D or an F, the teacher would work with the family and the student to identify what really needs to be done to demonstrate basic proficiency in the class by the end of the semester. And if maybe their letter grade wasn't quite exactly to 60%, but they set some criteria around key demonstration of learning, they would agree that they would go to pass-fail grading and give them a pass. That is how it's currently used in our system. The one thing we always want to make sure we talk with students and families about around pass-fail grading, whether it's as part of the IEP or 504 plan, is also overlaying that with a conversation around whatever their post-high school plans may be, and helping them do some research, because post-high school places view those differently on the transcript. So there are some colleges that say they'll take a P and they'll actually count that as a D and they'll do their own GPA calculation. So we always want families to be cautious about choosing that, because there are colleges that declare that as the way that they take the grade. So many colleges will take a high school transcript and do their own GPA calculations. Some will just look at the core subject areas and take out what they view as electives, which are still things that we consider part of the core as far as like those 17, art, PE, things like that. Those aren't elective necessarily because they're part of that core 17 they need to graduate, but they are, viewed more as electives in those core subject areas. So some colleges will calculate their own GPAs by taking all of those things out. Others will use all of it. Others will weight things like honors or AP classes. So it varies from college to college, and there's not a lot of consistency, but some do say that they'll take pass-fail grading and take a P and calculate the same way they would calculate a D. So that is just something that we have to overlay in that conversation with families as they're meeting with the teacher and discussing what makes most sense for students. I don't know if that answers your question. I tried.
But there's no state Board of Education rules against any class being pass-fail?
No.
And do you have any specific guidance on what Washington state colleges, how they do it?
No, I'd have to do a little bit of research.
Because it would be helpful to know what some of our flagship colleges in this state do. Because the reason why I ask is yes, I'm glad that option is available for students on the bubble. I'm really looking at on the other end of the spectrum, and the students that are taking so many classes or so much academic work in their core classes that we want learning to still be enjoyable and fun. And truly, if you're not an artistic student, what's the competency difference between if you have an 87 and a 94? Like, truly, I mean, there just isn't much. So, but the stress level associated for our students, I'm not sure they're getting a bang for their buck. And I mean this even for our core classes like PE, like 87, 94. What does that mean? And what does it impact to them? And we want them to thrive in all ways, including social, emotional, and mental health. And I worry that our addition of 7 classes, and we've heard it from Liberty, even though when they went from 8 to 7, that the stress they're feeling, that maybe we're not leveraging this vehicle in ways that we could, and that we should probably have thoughtful conversations with higher ed in our state, at least, to see like, what is truly the impact on a core versus a non-core class, because we should be sharing that with families so they can make that educated decision. Because it's no different than all of us who went to college. There were certain classes you could take pass fail. Some colleges are just pass fail. And I think that as at least over the 8 years I've been here, there's certainly been a pivot on the board about less focus on like the grades. And Director Moraldo has been really good about that and bringing that to the forefront about how grades and currency, and then for me connecting it to like, what is their impact on their mental health? And truly, if it's a pass fail grade that doesn't impact their future, then we should be giving students this knowledge so they can make the best choice for them.
Yeah, the only thing I will say is, and maybe I wasn't super clear, but as far as like when you say if there's any guidance or RCW WAC, if the student is not served with a 504 IEP and pass-fail grading is in there, the teacher by law is this person only person who can choose the grade of record. So no teacher, no parent or student can decide pass-fail grading. The teacher would be the sole decider of that per the law. That it doesn't specify. So I probably should have answered that earlier, but it doesn't specify that under pass fail. It just specifies that as the grade total, but that would include pass, fail, or letter grade. So the teacher is the person who determines that, unless there is guidance directly coming out of a 504 IEP or some of our ELL students who have ELL plans. So it's a collaborative discussion with students and parents most often, but the teacher is currently under the law as the person who can determine that. Just like any grade. So A, B, C, D, F, P, or U, which is unsatisfactory, which is similar to an F, and it's calculated as such in the GPA.
I think it's a really interesting conversation, particularly if you go back to what we were talking about before about additional paths for learning. Like we have statements about student exploration, but practically, how do they explore if I decide to go sculpt and I'm not very good at that, it becomes another stressor, right? I can't practically explore that other area if there isn't some sort of systematic way to say this is an exploratory course, whether it's pass fail or some other demarcation for it. And so I think it's in the same place. Like if that's one of our core belief systems, that there should be this ability to explore, then how does that actually come to life in the systems of the school? Because when you just said that the pass fail got calculated as a D, I was like, no.
Some places.
I know some, but like that hurt my heart. I was like, oh. So that I think that is an exploratory conversation.
Right. And that's the challenge around colleges. And as my kids went through, there are lots of caveats on how universities, colleges will interpret a student's transcript, of which the high school had absolutely no control over. And transcripts are also, at least, at the high school level, are very state controlled on, what can go on a transcript, what can't go on a transcript. And so it is a real challenge for students, especially when they start as freshmen, not knowing necessarily what their plans are at the end of at the end of high school in regard to going to college or university, and making choices about turning something into pass fail that might have a negative consequence at the end. So it is a sticky wicket.
Yeah, and it is frustrating because it puts our core values at odds. I mean, we're saying we want kids to explore, we want kids to follow their passion. Well, maybe I thought sculpture was my passion. Maybe I got in there and it's like, oh no, this was not my passion. But, you know, like in college, well, where I went to college, the teacher could say, yep, this class is just pass fail. I'm not going to try to grade your ideas ABC. It's just pass fail. It would be great if some of our electives could just be pass fail. Go in, work hard, but, you know, explore, follow your passion. But again, yeah, if colleges are going to say, and that's a D, no one's going to work.
Well,
So it's a bigger conversation.
I actually am even more shocked by that because we're specifically targeting pass fail to IEP and 504 students. And do they truly understand what you're saying is that you'll get nothing but a higher than a 1.0 when you do this? We're presenting it as here's this less stressful option. You can do pass fail instead of getting a grade. And it's like, well, what was the point of that? The student could have gone in, gotten a full grade, gotten a 1.2 and been better about it. I mean, other than your F isn't going to be a 0 or a point. I mean, and then F is an F either way. So if it's being counted as a fail, it's going to be a fail. If the pass is only you get a D, when actually, had I known that, I could have pushed my students, they would have gotten a D+ or a C-. To me, we're actually targeting IEP students to do worse because we're saying, use this pass fail, you'll be fine. And actually they won't be. I'm really shocked by this.
The IEP, just because it's part of the IEP doesn't mean all their courses are pass fail grading. So it means that they're eligible as an accommodation. So if they're earning Bs
Yeah, but that's
and all
not an accommodation. Your accommodation is you can just flat out get nothing better than a D in this class.
well, I'm saying if they naturally earned a C in the class, they would get a C. They wouldn't get a P. We would always give them what letter grade that it makes sense for them. So it doesn't necessarily dictate immediately that they get Ps in all their classes or any one particular class. It's part of an IEP decision of when and which classes. There are many students that may have that as an accommodation that it never goes. They never access it because they don't need it. It's there for them as they need it. It is not an automatic thing that happens at any one individual class. Did you want to add?
One of the beauties of the discretion of an IEP team is to decide where the student's most capable moment is. So it is not necessarily a 60% mark that hinges between the D and the F. You could say, I believe you are giving your very best effort in the situation we put you in, and name that an S grade. So if that makes it clear, it's not necessarily, and it's not intended to be an accommodation in the way I think you're thinking. You can move that threshold through the IEP team process to say, we see your very best effort and we acknowledge that with an S grade.
But that's not the P grade that then gets you the 1.0. Right. So what I'm saying is you're taking a special ed student, they're struggling in a class. You say, I'm going to offer you, instead of worrying about your GPA and the fact that you might get, a D+, we'll give you this pass fail option because you're really close. You're maybe at that 59, 60. And then, so I don't understand what's different about that than just letting the student know you got a 60, unless we're saying they've got a 58 or a 57 and we're giving them a pass anyway. And that would be the only way I could see that might be like, you're failing this class, but you're really, really close. So we're going to give you a pass anyway. Doesn't the teacher just have the discretion to do that for the student?
So yes, but that's what the IEP just makes sure that it takes it. So earlier when I was mentioning that the grading discretion lies within the teacher, this makes it so that the teacher can't choose to say, no, I'd rather give you the D when the family may and the student may prefer the P themselves. And so that discussion is a discussion where the family is present for and the student is present for, and they decide together as a unit in the IEP team what makes the most sense for that student for that class. And it generally is when it's below a 60%.
So I think maybe our consensus is we have a lot more conversations to have around, which we said around grading.
And I had one separate
Oh,
one
sure.
that I wanted to address, just because maybe it's because I had a kiddo that my last graduate from a comprehensive high school was in 2017. I didn't realize that all of our grad requirements around social studies now required the 1.5 credits of world history, because every single school says they require an additional 0.5 credit of world history. So if a student takes world history, then US history, then government, they're still going to be obliged to take another world history. From how I read this, like what's the other, like we used to talk about social studies classes might be a psychology class. Well, that's not a world history. So I see that we're actually losing some flexibility in what students are taking by having that extra 0.5 credit of world history. And I just don't know when that happened and why.
I'm going to phone a friend on that one.
And I'm sorry, this is normally something I would have sent to the
as long as I
staff
remember,
ahead of time. Well, just really quick, I would have sent this ahead of time, but I will admit that I did not come fully prepared for tonight's meeting. And when I read that, I'm like, what is this about?
Okay. In terms of, I am actually not going to be able to immediately answer without doing some research about kind of when the requirements shifted and which requirements, especially the 1.5 world history. I've just been living with that requirement. And so I can I can get back to you with some research about kind of making sure that we're not adding to the state requirement. We've aligned our expectations to the guidance by the state, but how hard those guidance rules are, I'd have to go and do a little bit more research. Yes.
Can I add a little bit that might be part of the answer to your question? So kids can take world history in their 9th grade year or honors world history. And in 10th grade, they can take, I'm just looking at Issaquah High School's course grade, they can take AP European history or AP Human Geography. And that gives them, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, the check mark of world history. Yes. It doesn't preclude them and say, well, if you take AP European history or AP Human Geography, you must still take another semester of world history. That's not how it works.
Correct.
Well, this says an additional.
Yes, but that counts as the additional world history.
The RCW on this gives like an umbrella of the types of classes that could qualify for that. And those AP Human Geography and AP European History meet that requirement. So there's choices at the sophomore year, and then those are year long. So they'll have extra because they're still required under the law for the civics.
Well, and so that's what I'm getting to is that if the student wants to take like a full year of government, then we're putting on extra.
Oh, I don't see how yet because
those are
because you have to have a year of world history,
that's
a year of US history. If you want to take a full year of government, you still have another 0.5 world history that you have to take, an additional 0.5 world history.
So, well, that is fair because AP there's only government class is the AP US government or civics.
Right.
But they could also take civics as a semester and then world history as a semester.
No, according to, so what I'm saying is that you're forcing that credit, that social study credit to be world history. And we have other things that might be psychology is considered a social study. So we're limiting that by saying it must be a world history class.
It must count under the world history bucket. Yes.
So you have to have actually 1.5 credits of world history.
Yes.
And I don't know why we just don't say in Issaquah, you have to have 1.5 credits of world history because all 3 schools are doing it.
But I think that might be confusing for the students that are taking human geography. So you take the 1.0 of world history or honors in the freshman year, and then you take the US history or the AP or IB equivalency. And then the sophomore year is that 0.5 of that world studies, when the senior year is the civics. But if they choose to take those AP classes, they're year-long classes by nature of AP. So then they are taking extra by nature of taking a year-long social studies class.
Mhm.
But it goes over and accounts for those world history classes if the student doesn't want to take the semester or the civics. So it covers the world history 3 and the civics if they choose those year-long options, but we can't fit a semester-long option for an AP course. And those are the AP courses that they take in place of that.
But to your point, it precludes somebody from taking 1 year of world history, 1 year of US history, 1 year of government, and 1 year of psychology, let's say, that counts as a social studies elective, but wouldn't count as the world history. So where does the world history requirement, so the 1.0 is a state requirement that it's world history, and but the state requires 3 credits.
State requires
Right.
credits.
So what you're saying is that by saying we want 1.5 of world history, it precludes that semester of being anything else.
To me, the real question is that world history 3 in the sophomore year, because that's the only one that's not called out in the WAC of whether that could be more choices would be available to students. It hasn't been that way in my recollection in like a decade in the ISD. I think we'd have to do some research about the why or the timeline of that and get back to you. But I think that is maybe at the core of your question, is that one particular class that's world history, could that be opened up to other electives like psychology instead? So it's not just world history 3 or AP European studies or AP human geography, but could a psychology live in that sophomore year for that other half credit?
Right. So I'm concerned about students get some world history, they get some US history, they get some civics, and whatever that 0.5 needs to be for them shouldn't necessarily be world history. What if unless that's in the RCW? And so I guess that's what I'm looking at. And especially if they take that third credit is a full year of government, does that help satisfy that 0.5 world history, or are they going to have to take something else? So that's what I'm saying is they could be taking 3 full years of courses and still not satisfied because we've designated that 0.5 absolutely must be US world history. And at that point, I'm not satisfied with that.
I'm the rookie high school parent here. So can you just highlight for me, if you want to see, when you pull up any one of these schools, pull up Skyline for me, actually, the bottom one, graduation requirements. In this chart, just for following up on Dr. Moraldo's question, what, if any, where do those veer from the state requirement? Is that all consistent with what the state requires? Or are there any?
All of that is state requirements. There's nothing.
Well, I know that's state required, but I'm saying, are there any that are higher, like for instance, social studies, than what the state requires?
No, they're all.
If you scroll down, you'll see our requirements. So there's several math requirements where we specify some stuff, and then the social studies requirement.
Right. I just want to make sure that that box there is all this is consistent with just what the state asks us to do.
Correct. The only thing I feel, honestly, the only thing that I do feel like I'd have to, even the math stuff of like, it has to be X amount above algebra. And there's like the lab science requirement. You can't just have like a science, all that it comes from the state guidance. We're not doing anything. I honestly believe the only thing would be the question of whether world history 3 under the RCW would have more choices. And I'd have to do some research on that.
Right. I remember
with my
the day
friend Rich.
Well, it's not about world history 3. It's about whether or not that 0.5 has to only be world history.
Correct.
No, I remember you might not have been on, Harlan, you might not have been on the board, but it was definitely in my 10 years, so 11 years, where, because this all came from Emily Hard. I mean, there was kind of this switch in the social studies and the alignment. And for example, Skyline used to do its equivalent of world history 3 in like their senior year, or civics in the night. They had something different. And it was just recently, because it was in one of our monitoring reports, that Skyline was switching to do it at the same sequencing or timing as Issaquah and Liberty.
But didn't this all start when the state mandated the 0.5 civics requirement. And
Yes.
we had
That,
to-
right.
There had to be another 0.5
Well, there
to add
has,
up to 3.
right, because they
Yes.
require 3 credits.
When Core 24 passed is when we went from 2 credits of history of social studies to 3. And during that time, they also somewhere in there passed the 0.5 of civics.
Right?
Okay, yeah, I found it on the state
2018
board. Did you find the
It's
state
the
board
first class of
information?
Core 24.
I didn't.
Oh,
I said 2018 was first class of Core 24.
yeah, the state.
Which is why my son graduated.
Yeah, the state board says 1 credit of US history and government, 0.5 of world history, geography, and problems, 0.5 credits of civics, and then 1 credit of a social study elective. May include 0.5 credits of a second semester of contemporary world history or the equivalent. So I think it was, so there must be some flexibility here. And then this is how we've determined to implement it here with our courses.
So,
Well, world history, geography, and problem.
so there's a whole credit that we are
Yes.
requiring above the state
Yeah.
by specifying it rather than it's an elective.
I'm sorry, what was that?
So there's a whole credit above, like the ISD is being specific about a whole additional credit.
Specific.
Social studies instead of,
Correct.
so we're limiting,
No, sorry.
it's a
Yeah.
total
Same
number, but as far as like
credits,
essentially
but what it
required
has to
versus
be.
elective, so
I'm actually sitting here looking at my students.
we're limiting student choice is what I'm hearing.
That's what I'm hearing.
Okay.
That, I would say that's not my experience. And so I'm struggling with the problem, like, be honest. Because the choice, for me, the choice comes in and what other history course satisfies the world's history? But are you saying that because it can't be in another discipline like social, like psychology?
Right.
But the state only requires 2 and we require 2
It's the specificity
Yeah, the
from the
specificity, correct.
state
The
versus
state
our
is saying
specificity.
0.5 of world history, and we're saying 1.5 of world history.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
So it seems to me that we could, there would
But
be
the
no
state also
reason.
specifies 24.
No, we
out
we
of
still
our
have to
students
say
being able to
3.
And you
do
still have to
28.
do 3 credits, but we could just as easily, I think, require 1 credit of world, 1 credit of US, 0.5 of civics, and 0.5 of anything in the social studies umbrella.
Yes, but I guess the point I'm making is the state is only equaling to 24 and we're equaling to 28.
No, we
No,
require
we're
24.
No, I understand that,
Oh,
but our students have the option of up to 28.
Oh, yes.
yeah, up to take
So-
up to 28.
They only,
Correct.
they
So
only have to
4
pass.
additional choices.
Mhm.
And so I guess I'm trying to understand is if the concern is the feeling that they have less choice, I actually don't think that's true. Because they have 4 whole additional credits of full choice.
But these are core classes. So we're telling
I
them,
fully understand what you're saying. I'm just
Yeah.
telling you, I'm not experiencing it the same way as limitation because the state is giving you how they would get to 24. So yes, they're being less specific in some of that 24. We're specifying up to 28. So 4 entire more opportunities of choice.
so mine would be that you couldn't just take 1 year of US history, 1 year of world history, and 1 year of government and satisfy the requirement. You will be then forced to remove one of your choices for something else to take the 0.5. Because we've specified that 0.5 must be in world history as opposed to world history or government or psychology.
But the government could be one of your additional opportunities between 24 and 28 if you want to
Right.
pile on.
Yes, but if I'm taking it, because people are taking either the half year of civics or a full year of government. And so we're not allowing those that are taking the full year of government to, it's basically you're being penalized. It's like, well, then I'd rather take a half a semester and just take the civics. It's just adding on additional requirements that I don't feel are necessarily, that's being defined.
Probably the only other piece of information I'd add is the OSPI has indicated that the world history standards, they recommend 3 semesters for the world history standards. So from what I can see with a quick look is that we aligned ourselves to the standards by structuring it as a 3-semester series of courses, and then offered some AP opportunities to extend that through their sophomore year.
Right, that's probably what happened when I remember Emily realigning us to that 3 semesters of world history, but yet having the opportunity for students to still basically check the box of that world history 3, or having that covered by being able to take the AP Euro or AP Human Geography in that sophomore year.
Right.
Still allow students to continue on the track to take US history or AP US history, and then AP US government would also cover the civics. And if kids didn't, of course, want to take that, they take civics.
Yes.
Right.
So that kind of helps with that alignment to the standards.
So, sorry, in that conversation, we're saying there's a OSPI is giving additional guidance on top of those specifics you just read from the state board. Okay, and we're aligning to what the OSPI guidance was on the 3.
We are in alignment with
semester
the
series.
standards. Yes.
Okay. I mean, I get that there's still concern, but at least it's logic based. Any additional conversation?
So building off of what Dr. Moline said about our students have 28 credit opportunities, can a student just register to take 5 or 6 classes?
A student has to be full-time enrolled, but underneath the law, and full-time enrolled would be 6 of 7.
Okay, so a student can just register for 6 classes if they want.
Yes.
Do students know that?
I don't think we advertise it because there's an equity with transportation access, but it still would be part of full-time enrollment. I need to do some research around what grade level that starts, in terms of whether there's a different definition for like older students versus younger. So I don't want to speak to something I don't feel super confident on.
And the reason why I ask is because so many of our students come into high school already with credits from middle school, whether it's math or science or language. And so we know that the junior year is historically a hard year. So it just seems like if we could, again, help them balance, that would be like, and by the juniors, a lot of people are driving. So the equity of driving is 1 less, and 2, if it could be where they could still stay on campus. If it's the middle of the day and they can just find a place to stay on campus and go to the library to do homework.
See, that's part of the challenge.
We're doing them a favor.
Yeah.
And so even if we just encourage it for the junior class, but I feel like we have to start thinking about things differently if we want to have different outcomes. And when we continue just to do the same thing, we can't be surprised that we have the same stressed out kids and the same number that on every healthy youth survey say that in the past 2 weeks, how many of you have contemplated XYZ? So if we're not willing to change things in order to move the needle on this, then we can't be surprised with consistently poor data. So if we're not sharing with our students and families that they only have to register for 6 classes, especially when they may be 4 or 5 of them may be AP or IB classes, then I think we're doing them a disservice. And so why I bring this up is this graduation requirement stuff, I think, is missing a lot of important information that will help our families and students be better consumers. And when our private schools, we need to look at, those are our competitors, are able to have those breaks built in for students, and we're not. Like, we're putting ourselves from a pure market standpoint at a potential for losing students and families, and we're seeing that. And we need to pivot our perspective to, this isn't like, oh, here's what you get because you live within the boundaries of the school district and you're a captive audience. We actually have a very uncaptive audience in this community. And I think we need to start pivoting how we communicate and how we share what options on what those true pathways are to graduation are and how the students can find their own balance.
So this is an area I will give a personal account because this is actually an area that I'm very impressed at Issaquah High. I do have a junior, and watching the kind of individual planning for what does that schedule look like and having a proactive outreach to the many juniors in my life currently on what is their schedule, what is their plan, what is their individual path to graduation and beyond. I've been incredibly impressed. Now, I have an IHS experience, but I will say all those things you just talked about balance, about mix of coursework, all those things. I've been very impressed with how they've approached that with the kiddos I know. I don't know the consistency across the high schools, obviously.
Yeah. Is there an opportunity offered to students to take whatever you want to call it, study hall, study skills, so that, because I can understand that it's a challenge to have kids if they only took 6 of 7 and they had 4th period off because of the way classes go. They have to have some place to go on campus, or they have to leave campus, because really probably a challenge to have kids wandering campus.
Sure.
But can they take something like a study skills class where it gives them a chance to work on their work of the day or de-stress or whatever would help them with their overall schedule?
Great question. Well, a couple things. One is that I want to reference those high school credits coming up from the middle school, is that part of some of the RCWs around this dictate that certain amounts of the credits have to be done in grades 9 through 12. So while they may already be advanced and be able to pull that up onto their transcript, they still have to do 3.0 of math while enrolled in 9th through 12th grade. So if they took that class in the 8th grade and even they put it on their transcript because maybe they got an A and it's helpful to their GPA and they want to show that, they still are required to access those 3.0 credits while enrolled in grades 9 through 12. So that's a part of that discussion. I just wanted to make sure I address that. And then to your question, yes, when we have those conversations and we talk about students really reflecting, we used to do a plate activity. I don't know, I'm sure that it's like evolved into like something where we did the analogy of like, how full will your plate be next year? So part of the plate is looking at like jobs, clubs, family and friends time, sports, and really talking about rigor. And a lot of this conversation stemmed from that homework load conversation that started, I don't know, maybe a decade ago or longer, where we talk about not feeling a sense of pressure or stress to take 6 or 7 AP or IB, but rather what are your passions and interests? And that's where you should be taking those, because how full will your plate be? And so in that conversation, long answer to a direct question is, in that plate conversation, we also talk about if you want to fill part of your day with some of that stress relief, here are lots of good options. And some of those are guided studies, which is a study hall class, as well as even a TA position. A lot of times teachers will only have, 10 minutes worth of TA stuff for a TA to do, and then they can use the rest of that time to work on homework and things like that. So it kind of feels a little bit like a study hall. The one thing is we can't have students under the law as far as they have to have a teacher of record while they're enrolled in supervision because of all the like safety things. And I'm sure it would be a conversation with IEA around the library just being open with, depending on how many students, if it was just open period. So right now, the places where that does happen is TA and those study hall classes that are available at all the comprehensives.
Fantastic. Any additional comments, conversation? If not, we have a motion on the floor, so we can move to a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Opposed.
Opposed. So 3 yes, 2 opposed, correct?
Mhm.
Okay, the motion passes. Thank you. Okay. Next. Okay, next we have a discussion of our budget development guidelines. So we are continuing our conversation on budget leading into next year. We have 2 items, I believe, that are ready for discussion. First is a budget development timeline from the administration, and then a second discussion on the board development guidelines. So I believe we'll start with the timeline conversation with the administration. So Superintendent?
Great. We have Martin Turney, Chief Financial Officer and Operating Officer, to review the timeline, which is part of our work to support the board development guidelines and moving forward with the budget process.
Thank you, Martin Turney. Tonight we have critical steps and target dates accompanying the budget development guidelines. Starting with tonight, presumed adoption of the budget guidelines. So February 9th, that would be the starting point for this timeline. We have 2 upcoming board directors retreats. So we plan to bring financial information for you for discussion. March 2nd is a planned community listening session, and followed by 2 board of directors meetings, March 9th and March 23rd, where the budget will be on the agenda. We plan to provide information on the website under the budget and finance section throughout the process, February through August. We're noting the legislature regular session ends scheduled to end April 24th. We have a board of directors meeting April 27th, and noting also the superintendent's budget review and program changes would need to be announced by April 30th. We're also, throughout this year, we are having financial advisory core team meetings. We started in the fall. We plan to have one here in the upcoming, likely in March, and then later on in the summer. The district budget is compiled and completed, the technical pieces, the logistics of getting it done, June, July. And our typical routine of public hearing in August, on August 10th, and then the proposed budget adoption August 24th. And so that rounds out the target dates for this year.
Thank you. How about I make a suggestion, since they are coupled items? How about we go through any additional comments we want to add on the actual board development guidelines? We'll open up for public comment, and then we'll get into discussion and questions on the package. That's okay. So
I can.
Suzanne, I will turn to you. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Okay, so we had a draft. We discussed it at the last meeting, and based on that discussion, we made changes to section 3. The only other change that I made to this after I sent it out to you all, after I had a conversation with the superintendent on the very first bullet point, where it says the budget should direct resources towards the support of, I added the words strategic plan to the district mission, executive limitation, and ends. And that was something we had discussed earlier, and somehow it just didn't make it in there. Nothing else changed from the previous meeting in section 1 or section 2. Based on what we talked about last time, where the superintendent indicated her expectation that she would present a timeline to the board. I think we just rewrote this section. So it says the following timeline will be observed. The board and the superintendent will agree upon a budget development timeline no later than the board's first regular meeting in February, which would be now. Within this timeline, if budget reductions are anticipated, a proposal will be presented to the board with adequate time for an iterative review process by the board. And the proposal should reflect the board priorities enumerated in section 1 while prioritizing the areas of greatest need. And that reference to the areas of greatest need, I know, was in the previous draft. So that was the change made here. It was less prescriptive. I think in part because we sort of changed what we were anticipating in terms of we're not going to see a spreadsheet and say yes to this bullet item, no to that bullet item, but we're going to talk more holistically about the budget and potential investments coupled with potential reductions. I don't know if I'm saying that coherently or not. But that is what I gleaned from our conversation at the last meeting.
Wonderful. Yeah, I know that that last conversation, we wanted to couple these two things, timeline as well as the guidelines. So what I will do now is I'll open up for any public comment before we get into discussion of both. So, no, I didn't ask.
She didn't ask for one.
I did not.
That's her thing.
Any public comment on these topics in the room? Any on the Zoom? Wonderful. So questions, discussion?
So I watched the discussion and I apologize that I wasn't here. And so I do have concerns with how section 3 was edited, specifically taking out language about having options presented to us. And why that is what Martin Turney just presented to us highlights why I'm concerned. So in the very original, it talked about having a proposal that's presented to us in February. And so as the timeline that was just presented to us, it says by April 30th, the superintendent will present a proposal. And that's exactly what my fear was and why that was critical, that initial guidance had a specific time frame for when that would be presented, because that's exactly what I didn't want to see. And that would be consistent with what we've just lived through the last 3 years. So I strongly am against this as written, and I can be the sole vote. So I'm not asking for you guys to rewrite it. I understand you want to pass it tonight, but those are my reasons why I am going to vote against this. And I have shared my concerns with the superintendent prior to this meeting.
Yes, Director Gallagher had shared his concerns with me and questions as well coming out of the last board discussion, as well as preparation for tonight. I do want to say that there is an error in the version posted for the development timeline guidance, which partially addresses a comment that Director Gallagher made as it relates to the April 30th date. It was erroneously stated that the budget would be announced by April 30th. And the revision that was supposed to be posted was that by April 30th, it would say superintendent's budget and program final review, which is, I think, substantially different and also gets to the intent that well, not the intent, the request that the board has made and Director Gallagher is restating right now. So I would want to amend that. We do have the updated version on that. There was also another slight change that I would want to say for community input. It was community listening session. That was the actual proper title of item 4 on March 2nd. So our apologies on the posting error, but those are the two differences that might help a little bit here, but in the conversation, but I wanted to say that right away. So you knew and could put that into context as you discuss.
Could you just read what you said for number 10 again, the words?
Yep. So number 10, the language should read superintendent's budget and program final review by April 30th. And the amended language and the amended language for 4 is community listening session, March 2nd.
I think part of the problem, I was good with the language we drafted, but I think when what I was anticipating in the timeline, I mean, this is a list of the retreats and the meetings, but there's no indication of what point are we in the process at any of these particular meetings. And I think that's where Director Gallagher is coming from. There's not, yes, there's a final review at the end of April, but at what point do we see an earlier review, or are we just discussing it? Or I don't know. It feels like there needs to be a little bit more specificity in what are our benchmarks at the different meetings, or what type of information would we be seeing, or I don't know, something more concrete.
But yet I think it's good because this is highlights why I was concerned and why I wanted this specific language in the budget development guidelines and why I still think it's important.
I would say, I feel like putting something in the budget guidelines says, what do we own? And I think we need to own when we want to see what our options are going to be in a year of cuts. And again, so it does specify board directors meeting, but it doesn't tell us what's coming before the board during that time frame with regards to the budget. So I'm not sure how having that, hey, there's a board meeting this week. Yes, but I mean, so for the April 27th, we have to finalize any cuts that are going to be made as far as staffing that needs to be announced. And that's not in here. And we can't really do that unless we know what are the items that, what do the cuts actually look like? How are things going to be spelled out? And so I think that there is a lot missing for me to be able to say, if I'm going to say, superintendent, I'm going to rely on you to create a timeline, and then the timeline doesn't really specify where the board's getting its information to be able to make its decision. I think that's what I feel is missing. And so part of that is, if I want to own that, then I need to have it specified in my part of the policy rather than offering it up and saying, well, it's up to you, is essentially what we're saying is you create the timeline and give it to us. And I think what Harlan and I are saying is we want more ownership of when we get that information.
I agree. I mean, so that number 10, the superintendent's budget review and program changes announced, like that is something that I would want to see this month. And I feel like we need to specify it in this document. Otherwise it's not going to necessarily happen. And if it's truly the first bullet under 3 is the board and superintendent will agree upon a budget development guideline no later than the board's. And if that one was watered down to what it is, then that should be no later than the first regular meeting in January. If all it is just providing us here's your cadence of meetings, which to point is what it said is like nothing about that tells us like what are the benchmarks along the way that we're going to be discussing in this journey of those cadence of meetings.
Yeah, it's about the depth of information we'll get along the way at each of those. I mean, I'm okay with the budget development guidelines, but the timeline, it would have been helpful to have more depth of telling the story of where we are in the budget development phases, as far as, the totality of our issue in more concrete terms, and then how we get to the actual things that will let us solve our problem.
So I think the question on that's coalescing is a greater level of specificity is required in one or the other of the documents. And so either it would be clarity on expectations that goes into the guidelines, or it is that along with if I'm hearing this correctly, along with in the timeline, that it isn't in addition to noting which meeting is occurring. So number 2 is tomorrow, a description of the deliverable that will occur on that timeline. Is that fair?
And frankly, I liked the changes we made to the budget guidelines. I like the budget guidelines being less prescriptive as long as we're good with the timeline. So I would prefer to see the specificity in the timeline rather than in the budget guidelines. And, we talked about, because we have the language in there about, I'm looking at the wrong thing. I'm sorry. Don't have that language. Proposal will be presented to the board with adequate time for an iterative review process. So somewhere in that timeline, we should know when that is. Right? When does the board get its first glimpse at a proposal? And by proposal, I don't necessarily mean, well, this is a spreadsheet of all your options with bullet points, but what the district thinking is of how we're going to achieve the budget reductions and still meet the ends and the needs of our students.
So I think maybe that elaboration would be helpful. I don't know if that's CFO or superintendent, but I think just a discussion of your currently undocumented thought process of what is the, I guess, elaboration of this information over the course of time in the timeline.
Before Mr. Attorney steps in, I want to share a couple thoughts. One is helpful guidance from the board. I think as we were constructing this, we partially modeled over past practice, which was around specific steps, as well as now wondering, because we haven't had the full set of conversations, which I think are helpful and instructive to be able to create more of a work plan related to scope and work deliverable overall. And then thirdly, as we get more feedback from the board as well, if that shifts a timeline, a deliverable, how do we accommodate that, right? So if this is the timeline that gets constructed now, and for example, if on March 9th, there is a specific item here that says deliverable is X, but then the board discussion actually asks us to generate more questions or asks us to take different turns, and there's new information or new discussion that's put forward, and that impacts the potential deliverable for March 23rd. We want to make sure how do we actually have some flexibility to adjust and adapt to what's required of coming out of discussion. So that's just something I have a wondering about. So the task here was through the lens specifically of a timeline. I'm hearing the feedback and I appreciate that and would happy to turn it over to Mr. Attorney for additional thoughts.
But before he goes, I want to respond to that. And I agree with that. That's why I think that where the rubber hits the road is the journey along the way. And I think trying to have that, expect that specificity in a timeline is unfair because every year is going to be different and every board meeting cadence is going to be like, we have a retreat on February 10th. We don't always have our retreats in February. They can be, they're various. So my point is what I really care about is when the superintendent provides budget review and program changes announced. That's what I really care about. And I think that time frame should be specified. So then we know that we're going to have time for that iterative review and discussion. And it may be where we have to build in extra time. We've had to build in extra special meetings in the past to have these discussions. So I think that we need to specify when we want to hear that superintendent's budget review and program changes announced. I think that's really important for us to know. And I think that's unfair on our superintendent to just have this be this nebulous thing. And I think the journey along the way, that's up to her. That is her responsibility to walk us through that journey, how she sees fit. But I think it's our responsibility to say, by this date, we need to hear what your proposed changes are. So we feel comfortable with what any sort of time frame may be. And for me, the second meeting in March is too late. The first meeting in March probably feels too late. And we only have one meeting in February, and that's the reps. That's why it doesn't necessarily have to even be the first meeting. I would be fine with no later than the last day in February to have that, because then at least I have time to look at it and then we can discuss it our first board meeting in March. But there has to be some time frame in my mind that we see what those program changes announced are that is listed. Because otherwise, as currently proposed and as currently given for our timeline, like our superintendent meets those guidelines as is, but right now it's not scratching the itch, I think, on the majority of the board.
I agree with everything you said, except that I would put that date in the timeline, not in the guidelines.
Right. And to me, I think this number 10, where the superintendent's budget review and program changes announced, or whatever the changed words by April 30th, is the holdover from our contract language where by the end of April, we have to determine RIFs. I think where it says announced, it's more about that final action. I think where we're missing is the earlier pieces where in one of these retreats or, board meetings in one of those earlier ones, could be a statement of the board receiving the first proposal as far as reductions, right?
Right. The timeline has the end. It doesn't have the beginning.
Right.
All we need is to put the beginning in the timeline.
Right. And that's around the specificity of a timing to receive that first.
And it could be at the retreat. It could, obviously, it can't be at this meeting.
Right.
But it could be at the retreat. It
Could
could be in March.
Right. It could be. And then the remaining meetings give us the iterative process of we look at it first, we give feedback, and then we get to look at it again at the next meeting that's in this list. And so those meetings are all of our iterative process of pushing and poking at it and trying to get to something that becomes the final, which we really have to do by April 27th, because that's when we have a board meeting, but really no later than that April 30th to meet the rules.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to provide what you were asking about potential cadence here and what our thoughts were behind those dates. So what's prepared for tomorrow would be a look at potential target or an amount for reduction. So we prepared some information for tomorrow, and following that meeting, that would lead us into the March 1st with a first potential listing or proposed reductions. So that what would come out of tomorrow's meeting and feedback from the board would lead us into that first or that March 1st meeting. And then, as you mentioned, you would have the following board meetings for iteration and consideration of those things.
And that would be great, but I think that needs to be in the timeline.
And I think community input the day after you're going to announce this is not time. That's not realistic to ask the community to respond within 24 hours.
To clarify, it would be more global in nature. So there's the specificity that we can then continue to refine with the board to then be able to test specific ideas with the community to get input on. So we might be thinking about different kinds of representation of detail levels, which as Mr. Attorney mentioned, providing sort of the global feedback based on the discussion that we have tomorrow to be able to get to a set of, I would call that potentially options, right? Or discussion points that then helps us further refine, but we can also then queue that up to be tested with community input, which prepares us for a sort of a more detailed review. So I think we're thinking about announcement in different ways. And so I don't think we'd be announcing which positions exactly, because that would not be, able to be, that's sort of very finite, but we certainly have to start moving in that direction, especially in the two official meetings on March 9th and March 23rd.
So would it be fair to say that, I guess, potentially what you're offering is, because again, I'm trying to work between the two documents, is that the board guidelines is that guidelines that can be applicable to any year. And the timeline is really school year specific of how we'll execute in this particular process. I think if that's what we're saying, I think I get that. I can certainly think that makes sense. And then I think the additional level of detail that you just said, CFO Attorney, which is that in this year specific timeline, that tomorrow, I'm just trying to make sure, so that today would be about finishing the guidelines. That's our deliverable, right? We have budget guidelines and an agreed to timeline in line 1. Line 2 would be about agreeing to, I believe what you said is targets for the amount of reduction, if I wrote my note correctly and can read it, would be the deliverable out of that conversation. And that March 1st would be a first potential, I guess, I'm not sure what you called it. I wrote first potential reduction list. I'm not sure what was said.
I wrote proposal / options / discussion points.
Discussion points. That's probably why I stopped writing. But I mean, maybe we can firm up what that deliverable is in as clear and concise ways we can get to budget guidelines and then to target reduction amount, whatever that next phase, that next one is. Then there would be community listening that follows that. And then the 9th board meeting and the 23rd would be what, down selection? I'm not sure what word I would put there to feasible options.
So I think we would be, with the direction that we get tomorrow, we would hopefully be able to further construct the more finite. So depending on what target looks like for reduction, that could mean different levels of depth of reduction, which requires a different level of work.
Right.
So I think that the March 9th, March 23rd would be working through, right, really what some of the details are and talking those through. So it's clear what's happening to our community, but also the board has multiple opportunities to discuss that publicly and together. But sort of maybe a similar time, I mean, similar, but we'd make slight adjustments probably depending on where we land after tomorrow.
So just to kind of overall, I think I'm okay with the language in the budget guideline. Not okay with the originally proposed timeline. Looking forward to get something more specific because I know Anne, I'm looking over her notes going, it's a confusing change. So I hope we get something that is more specific for us. But I think in the future, then I would want to make sure that we are addressing our budget guidelines at the first meeting in January with a proposed timeline associated with it. So that if we're not in agreement with the timeline, we have time to fix it before February comes. Because I think the problem is now is like, I almost have to submit to whatever timeline because I don't have time for another iteration of the timeline before we're actually like, yeah, by the way, I think we're going to need to have this discussion sooner rather than later kind of thing.
So I'm going to make a proposal, which is, would we be willing to take a 15-minute recess? Give you that opportunity to update this timeline and then come back and complete the discussion with those deliverables as we discussed.
I guess I just want to say it's interesting that many of my very hardcore policy governance colleagues want to provide a lot of input and fingerprints on a timeline, which is an operational component of what the district does. And I find that very interesting versus I just want to impact policy and have our superintendent stay within the bounds of policy. And I agree with January timeline would probably be helpful, but sure, getting around this and having a very detailed timeline would meet my needs, but I think that's actually more inconsistent with how we are as a governance structure. But just
we're not telling her what to put in the timeline. We're just saying we want specificity in the timeline.
By doing that, we're essentially saying what we want. I mean, I think that's foolhardy to say.
But that's what we were doing in the guidelines.
But that the guidelines are ours. The timeline is not ours. That's why that's the difference. Like, I'm not proposing the timeline. I'm saying that they're like, so that's my whole point. That's why I think the timeline is problematic because that's not mine. The policy part is mine and the budget development guidelines are mine. And that's why for me, it matters.
I think we say though, the board and superintendent will agree upon a budget development timeline.
Yes.
So to me, that says we are going to take two actions, one on our guidelines and one on the timeline. So I see that as we're taking action on that. So then if we're taking action on it, then it is ours. And we're specifying it here.
Right. And that is definitely different than what we've ever done before because we've never taken action on the timeline. It's just been words inside the blurb, right? The motion has always been about the approval of the district budget development guidelines itself, and the timeline was just provided.
That's a good clarification. Because the action is about budget development guidelines, and this has been further detail that's been provided. So we're shifting a little bit more, which is totally good feedback and helpful. And this has not been, we've had a lot of high growth, so we haven't had to do a lot of reductions over the past 10, 15 years. So I will say that it changes things if we actually have to adopt a scope and sequence for our budget discussions, which is different from a timeline. So, but I'm trying to figure out how we can get to the middle road, right, of what's needed, but also what's intended, right, from our process operationally.
I mean, the other thing is we review these every year, and every year we can insert the timeline within the document. I mean, that would be the other option, but it would be us building that timeline.
Well, or in conjunction. But you're right, if we approve it. So I mean, they're solving this year's problem of doing something that can allow us to move forward. And then there could be the longer term solution of how to do this better, starting in January next year, and potentially having both the budget guidelines, which maybe wouldn't change much year to year because of the way they're developed, but the timeline would add the specificity for that year.
Right. But my point is that's where I know I wasn't here for the discussion in the last meeting, but like, that's why I'm like, I don't believe the wording should say we shall agree on a budget development timeline. I think it's just really getting into the weeds that I don't think that we belong in, but that's just me.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but we put a date in that said that they were going to act on a timeline. So there is a natural conflict between those two in the first way it was written and not. So I'm going to ask again, because I am going to call 15 minutes break here. So I think, is that what we would like to do? Is have an opportunity to add deliverables or some other update that moves the conversation forward.
To be clear, is the request that we go back and do operational planning in 15 minutes and come back to you with specific objectives and
my
work
request is
deliverables?
that you would write down what you think is going to happen on these dates. Otherwise, we can just take a vote as it is.
I mean, Martin more or less laid out how he thought it would roll out. Now, I realized I take the point that you made, which is things could shift depending upon feedback of the board. And I think we understand that.
But I think the two key dates are what our discussion is going to be about tomorrow, which is already settled, and the expectation of what we get March 1st.
Yeah.
After that, it doesn't have necessarily specificity because that's where we go through that iterative review and dig deeper into it. I don't know what other than it's like the next level. Each time we have a discussion, the output could change as far as, what those proposed changes are. So it's really, to me, those first two that Martin described as happening on February 10th and March 1st are the important ones.
I would agree with that.
Dr. Mullins, I think you probably have the votes you need to move forward. So I think you should just save our time and just go forward. That would be my suggestion.
Well, as I said, I am going to ask for a 10-minute break. So we will break here. We'll come back at 9:33 and we can wrap up the discussion and then move forward. So we'll be back at 9:33.
What should I turn?
Okay, thank you. Okay, we are back. Thank you for that brief intermission. Greatly appreciated. So as we've been discussing this connection between the board guidelines on budget and the specific targeted timeline for this particular budget year. And had been having a discussion, I think, of a want and feedback of being able to memorialize a couple of these key dates with additional detail about what would be provided, what would be the deliverable out of these upcoming steps. Again, not all, but I think the suggestion from Director Moore was really kind of the start. At number 2, you had was it March 1st?
February 10th and March 1st.
February 10th and March 1st, I think, were the 2 that you had suggested. So I don't know if during that brief break, we'd had any opportunity to think about how we might or might not absorb some of that input.
So first we can show what we had intended to be posted originally, which has a little bit of not different detail, but different words that I think were meant to suggest that we were going through a public conversation along the way that was iterative. And so that it was not meant to say that we would be announcing any reductions to the board or to the public in April. We would be happy to also, so we can show that on the screen just so you can refer to it, because that was language that I had said I would had been originally intended, and that I would want to amend what was publicly posted. So can you please show that, Stephen? Okay. And Mr. Turney and I discussed adding, so I wanted to show you this first before then telling you what we were hoping to potentially add. On the, I don't know, got very small for some reason. Like skinny.
There you go.
Yeah. So February, oh, yes, that's okay. That's good. I think that will be great.
Yeah, that's
yes.
Right there is perfect.
Can you scroll down so we can just see the top of the the list here? Perfect. Stop. Thank you. So for February 10th, the specificity, there's Board of Directors retreat to discuss target reduction numbers. That's like not the perfect language, but again, that we have to sort of add all that. We will be happy to add that. I heard Director Callender say it's about the beginning and the end, right? So to make sure that that's clear, so that's very clear. However, discussing targets is not the only part of what he was saying, and what I heard the rest of the board also say. So we would say something on March 9th specifically, more detailed view into actual proposed reductions. So those are the 2 points I would add. Is that what we discussed, Mr. Attorney?
That's correct. Yep.
And then I think it's 10. No. If you could just scroll down slightly to see 10.
Right. That point on announcement is was very
right
clear.
Yeah.
And that's actually not what we had originally, as I said. There was an error in posting the wrong version. That was a prior version that we had been modeling every year after in the past.
Okay, so just to make sure, the updates that you're putting forth would be for the update to the timeline, and that timeline would include an update to number 2, That number 2 would include, in addition to having board directors retreat, it would have target reduction numbers. And then for number 5, the March 9th date, in addition to board of directors meeting, we would include
First draft of budget reduction.
first draft of budget reduction.
March 23rd. So that, yeah, those are the key things I think I heard.
And then that would allow for any additional comment iteration work on the first piece, which is about target numbers, on the second piece, which is about more detailed information on budget reduction prior to finalizing, which would be coming in that number 10 in April 30th. Did I? Okay.
Correct.
Okay, any comments, questions on that?
Not on this, but I do have something beyond that. So about back to the budget guideline piece.
But if we can close on any other items on this one, then we go backward. Go back to that. Okay, so no other comment on this, comment or question on that. Okay, so then your point on the budget guide.
So I think one of the things is, so partly because today, even if we don't have separate action on this timeline, although I think that this is much better, but more to the point of being so specific that we're putting in this guideline that we're going to take action on something else and removing that, I would like to make a motion to amend the budget guideline to remove the words saying the following timeline will be observed. The board and superintendent will agree upon a budget development timeline no later than the board's first regular meeting in February within this timeline. And then, the little I would be crossed out and a big I for if budget reductions. So the statement would simply begin if budget reductions are anticipated. So, and I emailed it to Diana, to you.
I see.
So that's my motion to remove that language.
So there's no motion.
Well, no, I'm a motion to amend.
We had.
Oh, we didn't have a
We
motion.
did not.
Oh,
This isn't on the table yet.
This is on the table yet.
But since you brought it
then
up,
I'll proffer
explain to
that.
me why. I'm sorry, I didn't have my mic on. Can you explain, even though we're not going to do this right this second, can you explain why?
I think because I think the tying a specific, stating in this document that we're going to approve a timeline that we want the superintendent to draft. And here's the guidelines for that. I think specifying that we're going to approve a timeline, to me, is where, back to Harlan's point of getting into the weeds. And that's at the point. We present the rest of it has the guidelines by which we want the timeline drafted. And so I think for me saying, hey, you need to give me this timeline no later than the board's first regular meeting in February kind of thing. Taking that piece out, that we're just saying we want a timeline that gives us time to, if there's budget decreases, that reductions, that we have time to iterate on that.
Yeah, my only comment on that would be, we tried not to say that the board is approving the timeline. It's simply, so like there was not going to be a motion to approve the timeline. It was simply that the board and the superintendent would agree upon a timeline. So it's a little less prescriptive than that. And I think we're to a place right now, based on what I heard, that I at least could agree upon that timeline. So I don't know. I think it's actually better to have it in there because I do think we want something that anchors us to the first part of February to start the process.
Well, I think that approving a board calendar that has us looking at our guidelines in January, we'll proffer that.
But where would that get memorialized?
Well, that can be through our that could be one of the items we add to our monitoring calendar, right? Where we say when we'll monitor things. And we sometimes add other actions. So I mean, like in agenda planning, we plan out when we're going to do things. That object of starting this discussion about the budget development guidelines should start happening, you know, the first, if that's what we determine, the first meeting in January, so that then we have a more iterative process to look at the budget development guidelines and the timeline together. So I think that would become the responsibility of agenda planning and could be noted in kind of our calendar.
Which brings me to a greater point of, so where is the budget guidelines in our board policies? I'm not.
Is it in the financially? I don't know. Is it in the financially else? It
can't
might
remember.
not be. It might not be.
You mean that the board must do the guideline? That there's anything that says we actually take this step?
Right.
I don't know off the top of my head. If there is.
Fairly sure it's there.
Because in a way, it's almost like an executive limitation around budgeting.
Yeah, and it
Well, and it might be in there, but I would have to look.
But see, all of our ELs are back facing, right? We look to arrears. And really, other than the board calendar, which is GP4E. So maybe this is supposed to be a GP of some type.
Well, it could be in the GP that we.
I don't think
must
it is.
annually
Right,
do
and then,
budget
but then
development
it would be that GPE, right? The addendum to it. Because our actual board calendar that gets approved,
Right, is 5E.
is it 5E? Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was the document I was referring to. It's usually about our
It's 4E.
monitoring. Oh,
Right.
4E, sorry about that.
I was right, it was
sorry about
4E.
That we would indicate in there that we want to well, whether it's start or approve, you know, in one of those January.
Yeah, it's
dates.
not in here.
Right. Oh, no, I agree. It's not in there, but that's where we could put it.
Right. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to go through and look at all the policies, but off the top of my head, I don't think any of the policies specifically addressed budget development.
I think it would likely be a GP. It's a role of the board to approve or to provide the parameters for the budget. And I think it would be that one,
Yeah, but I don't think.
you know, a similar
job description.
addendum such as 4E, GP4E, it would be GP whatever E, where we would have the actual guidelines that get approved every year.
Yeah, it's not in there. We could add it, but it's not in there.
We can worry about that
Yeah,
maybe
I would say
tomorrow.
let's not worry about this
but-
one today.
We either need a motion
Well, I'm happy to give you a motion if you want one.
or,
I was waiting for Sydney to
or
go there.
the amended motion, you know, I mean, or something,
Hang on.
whatever starts it.
Except I've lost the agenda.
Yeah.
I'm lost.
I just want to make sure I don't lose the point of where to memorialize. it.
Okay. Do you want a motion?
I do. Thank
Okay.
you.
I move the board adopt the 2023-24 district budget development guidelines as presented.
Second.
Okay, we'll take a vote. All those in favor?
Well, wait,
Wait,
Marnie,
wait.
does Marnie want to
yeah.
do her amendment?
I did not hear any support for that, so I won't waste our time. Because if there's no support, I wouldn't get a second, blah, blah, blah.
So you're not. entering
Correct.
something.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, I'd prefer to leave the language in there, so I'm not supporting you.
Am I missing any other comments? Sorry. Right. Vote. I would like a point of discussion actually before I call that vote. Is the assumption in your motion that the timeline is updated as we discussed?
Yes. Well, I mean, I moved to approve the budget development guidelines no matter what. The question then is, did we agree on a budget? I'm sorry. Wow. I propose that we pass the guidelines. Did we agree on a timeline no later than February? I would agree to the timeline as they proposed to adjust it, amend it, edit it.
Okay, I just wanted to work through that because I think that was
Yeah.
part of Marnie's point. So just make sure I understand.
Yeah. But I don't think we need to formally approve it or anything like that. I think it's just the board nodding up and down. Yes, we're good with the timeline.
Okay, thank you for
My
allowing me that clarification of what you were putting forward. So we have a motion, we have a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed?
Nay.
Thank you. Was that 4
Yes.
ayes? 4 ayes, 1 nay. That passes. Thank you. Next, we're on to legislative matters, and we are over to Director Gallinger, please.
So holdings. Was in Washington DC that like 2 weekends ago. I lose track of time. It's been a long week. I sent you guys all a presentation that I thought was actually really helpful, and it was one of those things where, I think that Ron was very clear to us last year that this was something that we were going through in Issaquah that other districts would follow, and they had no idea that they were going to be following that. And certainly we've seen lots of news stories about how districts around us are having this impact of budget. But to see that it isn't just a Washington State thing, that it's nationally, and that in forecasts in 2024 and 2025 is going to be a rough year for school districts across the country.
I thought that was also just a really good presentation in general. I liked the way it talked about how to frame the conversations with the public. There was some really good stuff in there. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I thought that I agree. And I asked Wazda to invite her to a pre-conference session because I think that would be really helpful, because I think a lot of school districts by next November will be feeling that and having that expertise. That would be really helpful. So it's part sessions, part hearing from, legislators, and where the ranking education committee members, like there's going to be no movement on special education funding. There will be no more money. Like, oh, thank you for that as we go into our meetings with leaders. So all the senators and representatives were broken down by the various, there was about 20 of us from Washington State who were there. And of course, I live in the 8th. So I went and met with Representative Schreier along with other colleagues. And it's interesting that when they added with the redistricting, we are in the same district as Granite Falls, which is very weird to think about, a very small district in Snohomish County. That picked up, as well as down to Bethel. And then of course we know the Eastern Washington district. So we have a very interesting district as far as our perspective. But it was a good meeting with Representative Schreier and having a conversation about focused on special education as well as school lunch. In addition, the Washington delegation met with the Department of Agriculture about school lunch and universal free lunch, as well as with the Department of Education, focused on special education funding and the impacts of that. And one of the things that came out of that was, they're like, we look at Washington data compared to other states, and Washington school districts don't access Medicaid funding at levels that most other states do for the services that are being delivered in school districts that are special education therapy mandated, whether it's physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, all these things that are, if you're a student who has Medicaid, that you could theoretically get funding for. If we think of like all the mental health services that we're delivering through all of our Swedish mental health counselors, to my knowledge, we don't bill certainly families for any of these services, but we don't bill the state potentially for these services. And so they brought up a good point, and given how large of a school district we have and how big of a footprint we have with the number of special education students, as well as the mental health services that we have, it begged the question. And so then I reached out to the healthcare authority. That's the state agency part of DOH who oversees the Medicaid programs for the state, and embedded within that, they have a school-based Medicaid services program within it. And so they were really fast to respond, like within hours, they responded to me. And so I've forwarded that information to the superintendent. And so they're like, oh, this is really timely because we are looking at how we service school districts and how can we better increase this access. So interesting for our school district, we haven't accessed Medicaid funding since 2021 as a school district. And I don't even know what the dollar amounts were. And so part of the balance of this, wearing my healthcare hat, is if it's so cumbersome that you don't actually drive value because it's regulatory and you spend so much on FTE trying to get the dollars, it's not worth it. But it's worth us exploring, and certainly as Medicaid in our state looks to sort of maybe renew their commitment to K-12, to say, hey, from a rulemaking standpoint, let us share with you what the impact is if you open this up, but then you make the regulatory burden so high, then you're actually not opening it up. So I think it's a timely part for us to be able to share what that impact is, in the same way that special education, for us to do safety net funding, we spend like 1.2 FTE in this building just to access safety net funding.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a important opportunity. So stay tuned for that, because we may have a DOH meeting on top of this is why I bring this up, of our DCYF meeting. So we are going to be meeting with Secretary Hunter and his team to talk about two things. One, institutional education, but two, there is this ongoing ping pong battle or tug of war, depends on how you look at it. And I think on a day-to-day basis, they decide which it is for transitional kindergarten. And so we've just started it, right? We just had our first couple weeks of it. But having the data for who we're serving and who we're not serving will be really helpful to inform that discussion. Because while we have a class of 12, I want to know what was our potential universe, like how many students within our boundaries would have qualified by whatever standards we set. And there's this tension in Olympia right now between, is it going to be DCYF who owns this, or is it going to be OSPI who owns this? Is it going to be Department of Early Learning? So there's this big tension and fight between this, and then, because it's not just from a programmatic standpoint, but then where does this funding come from? Because this was a surprise sneak in that started up in Bellingham and is sort of propagated across organically in our state that wasn't part of the original funding. When you think of categorical funding for schools, it wasn't in their calculus. So now it's long. That horse long left the barn, and so they're just going to have to figure out how they deal with it. And so when we met with Representative Sen, I think you were with me at that one, she specifically asked us at Cedar Trails, like, where do you think this lies? And so I think we need to be prepared, our superintendent, with like have a really robust discussion about transitional K. Because I think that, as you know from your past history with Secretary Hunter, education, even though he's Secretary of DCYF, he really does care about education and the funding streams that gets us there. And so I think he does have a personal interest in this. So for our legislative day on the Hill, we will start at 8 a.m. with our first meeting. with representative, and that last meeting will end at 4, just so you guys have the boundaries of your day. And if everyone can't make it for the DCYF meeting from 3 to 4, I totally get it. So I'm trying to then put in between lunchtime and 3, a DOH meeting for any who may be interested in that. And you may be like, no, I'm gonna have a nice coffee break in the Capitol instead, which is also fair. I've reached out to the governor's office as well to try and get that time for our students that they historically have gotten. I think another poor planning for WASDA, besides planning it on a midwinter break weekend, is that apparently it's the first Monday after fiscal cutoff. And so they're all planning, at least as is, to be in chamber voting that day. So it's going to be a very squishy schedule. And again, I don't think that's something that was really contemplated when they put it so late in the year, but they probably should have thought about that, because that's like the fiscal cutoff is something that's like we could tell you what the fiscal cutoff is for the next X number of sessions. So it's going to be in flex. We're going to have to be flexible. Everyone knows that we're coming and knows and have committed to it. So that's why we have like planned from 8:30 to 9, because that's before it starts. And then tentatively 11:30 with Senator Mullet for hopefully lunch. Remember, we did lunch with our students and then so several in between that. And so most of them will be between 8 and noon, if not all of them. So, and then our executive branch meetings will be afternoon as far as I try and build the day. Because I figured our students would probably get on the road and not want to stay for the DCYF meeting, which would be probably low yield for them anyways, and that's totally fine. The big part is early, and they're used to getting up early. They have school at 8 o'clock every day, so 8 o'clock for them is normal. And yeah, so I'll let Marnie weigh in for anything else from Advocacy Institute, and then anything else that you guys have questions wise about Olympia. Feel free.
I actually flew back before Advocacy Institute began, but as the chair of NSBA's Public Advocacy Committee, we did go through some of the discussions about what was interesting is in the latest bill that was passed just before Congress ended in December, they added about $1 billion towards IDEA, which is why I think they went in going, yeah, and you're not going to get anything extra. We just put in more money. But of course, that didn't show really the percentage of dollars that had gone down, because they were down to providing 14% of IDEA or special education funding as a whole, as a whole part. And it had been, they've promised 40, they've never made it to that. And they got it all the way down to 14, I think it was last year. So I don't know where that extra $1 billion puts them percentage wise as to what they're contributing. And I think it'll be interesting to see when those dollars actually come to us, which will probably be starting next school year, I would assume, when we see that allocation. So I think that's one big piece. Another thing is that in an effort to, I'm trying to remember, money went into something. I'm sorry, I don't have my notes in front of me. Money went into something so that the compromise was to eliminate the child tax credit. And so that is something that's going to impact our families, is that they will not be getting the same level of tax. It has tax implications for our families, that they will not be getting that tax credit this coming year. So that was part of the negotiation around that. But other than that, that's really all I have to share, because I wasn't able to stay for the whole conference.
Any other questions particularly about Olympia?
I was going to ask around the Medicaid piece. Does it have also anything to do, because I'm trying to recall as a parent of a special ed student that I actually had to check a box saying that, yes, I would allow the district to go after Medicaid dollars. And I didn't know what there's some reservations, because I'm, as the parent making that decision, what's the implication for my student? Is this going to come into this whole, do I qualify? Or is it the district was just going to go after that money without worrying about whether or not I qualify? would it impact my child's ability to collect disability afterwards, which is why I checked it. I figured, well, if he's receiving Medicaid services now, would he qualify for disability later on? And I don't know what all of those implications are, even as a parent of a kid that went through our whole system on an IEP. So I think there are a lot of interesting pieces to that I think I would love to get more understanding about Medicaid and its relationship with students on IEPs and how that whole system really works. I think there's a lot of probably a lot of complexity, but why is it? And is it as a district with parents of means, are they not checking that box? So I think more questions for me.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you. I look forward to our trip to the Hill. Next is announcements and correspondence. Is there any additional announcements or correspondence that we need to share? Okay, we've got one more tonight. So we have one more, yes. So next in calendaring agenda topics, we have the proposed board meeting calendar for 23-24 school year. Do I have a motion?
I move the board adopt the 2023-24 board meeting calendar as presented.
Second.
Thank you. Any conversation, discussion?
No, I'll just mention as we discussed the calendar and worked on it, that the meeting in December was moved from December 7th to 6th because December 7th at sunset is the start of Hanukkah. And then all of their meetings are basically on their normal Thursdays. Did want to throw it out, to the board because it's really choice of ever moving off of our Thursday, but like on Thursday, November 9th is the day before the holiday of Veterans Day, which is November 10th. And whether anybody wanted to amend or move it. I know Wednesdays was problematic for some board members. And so didn't want to just arbitrarily change it off of the Thursdays for anything other than a religious holiday.
I have an ITC board meeting every Wednesday, most Wednesdays prior to our board meeting.
So sticking with the Thursday is the right thing. Okay, then that's all I wanted to bring up.
Thank you for going through those couple of choices in there. Okay, we'll move to a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, passes with 5. Thank you. And with that, we will.
Well,
adjourn.
and I was going to say really quick, it's not an agenda item. It's about our agenda that might help today is that we may want to specify the word action
Yes.
in the title of any of the ones where we're actually going to take action.
Yes, we have to clean that up as I've been going through it. We will 100% take that suggestion. Any other agenda